of violence in the workplace training. We thank you for taking the time to be here with us this morning. We know you're awfully busy and that you've got a lot of things going on, especially through this crazy time during the pandemic. My name is Satvinder Basran. I am the director of the council, who will be your host for this morning's session. I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Semiahmoo and Kwantlen First Nations, which includes the Coast Salish peoples. I also would like to acknowledge the lands and the territories of the First Nations that you are all calling in for today to attend this webinar. Before we begin our webinar, I'd like to share with you a few items. This webinar is being recorded, and it's going to serve as a record for the sector for future so that folks can access it and use that information, that we can build our inventory on the work that we're doing. Because there's a lot of information that's going to be covered in this webinar, there will be no breaks. However, opportunities throughout the webinar for you to raise questions in the chat will be made available to you. And Phil will respond to your questions in a timely manner throughout his presentation. During the webinar, there'll be two polls that will be questioned to you, so please make sure that you participate on them. You will also be receiving a survey or an e-survey, which we would like you to complete. It helps us improve the sessions as we're developing them in the future. The survey should pop up right after the webinar, or it may be sent to you in your inbox within 24 hours. And if you haven't received it, please by all means feel free to reach out to us, and we would be delighted to get that to you. Now, information pertaining to this webinar and the previous webinar that was on mental health, we'll be posting that information early next month, hopefully, knock on wood. And my understanding is that there will be certificates of participation for the attendance that will be sent out as well. And so please stick around till the end of the webinar, and we will be very excited to share with you what the council has been working on for the sector towards the last quarter of this year. Now, before I introduce Phil, injuries related to violence are a very serious concern to all of us. These types of claims in community social services have been prevalent for more than a decade. To quickly highlight some of the importance around the statistics, which I will cite from WorkSafe from 2016 to 2020 in the three classification units that we're a part of: counseling or social services, job and life skills, and residential social service facilities. Acts of violence force claims attribute to 24.5% of all the number of claims. But what's really intriguing is that the costs that are associated to those claims are 37.4%. The source that have been identified in this claims management system have been people. And they range from the period from 43 to 56%. Another very important statistic that I'd like to share with you is the total work days lost have doubled from 2016, which were 37,000 work days lost, to 2020, which is roughly 88,000 work days. So there are a lot of things that are happening in our sector that we need to be very mindful of and be aware of. Our sector is a part of the high-risk strategies plan at WorkSafe BC as well. The last statistic that I would like to share with you that's really important is the injury rate. The injury rate in 2020 in our sector in the combined three classification units is 3.0, while the BC average is 2.1. We're almost 1% above the provincial average. And what this translates to is basically for every 100 workers in our sector, 3 will be injured. So there's a lot of work ahead of us to address this monumental challenge. And I'm well aware of a lot of the challenges that we are all facing as organizations and folks as around the table to deal with this complex issue. And just the myriad of complexities of the type of services that we're providing throughout British Columbia. So I'm delighted to introduce you to our keynote speaker this morning, Phil Eastwood. Phil is one of Canada's premier human resources training facilitators who specializes in respectful workplace behavior, workplace violence prevention, and leadership. Now, he's one of 62 certified speaking professionals in Canada. And so this was a very intriguing observation that we're very lucky to have him to speak to us. Now, he served for 27 years with the New Westminster Police Department for 27 years and retired in 2015 as an inspector. Prior to coming to Canada, he also served as a police officer for 8 years in London's West End Metropolis Police Service as well. Phil's career focused on working with people in crises, and he has learned the impact of how professional and respectful communication can have a positive impact on people's lives. There's no doubt about it. It's really wonderful to see someone as passionate as myself looking and working towards, addressing health and safety in the workplace. But now I'm not going to put Phil on the spot. But one question I've been dying to ask Phil was that, are you related to Clint Eastwood, that famous actor or director? But you don't need to answer that question now, maybe later. But please, everyone, welcome Phil. And we really look forward to hearing him speak. Thank you. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you very much indeed, Seth, and thanks everyone for being here this morning. I'm wondering if I can have access to the shared screen facility here, so I can just pop that screen up there and we will get going. Thank you so much for joining us. Just waiting for my share button to pop up so I can thank you very much. Bear with me here as we get the slide deck up. In answer to someone's question already, yes, there is a PDF version of this presentation, and there's more information to come as well. So welcome one and all, everyone, to this webinar this morning on workplace violence prevention. Just to sort of manage expectations, I'd like to do, first of all, a really important thing, which is a land acknowledgement. I'm in North Vancouver, Lynn Valley here, and I acknowledge that I'm on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish Nation, Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and Musqueam Nation. And thank you for joining us from wherever you are as well. In terms of the timing, I think you have a good idea of that. We're running until 12 o'clock. I am, as Sat said, I'm passionate about this, so please manage your breaks appropriately. But I've got a ton of stuff here to share with you, and I wanted just to I'm going to run through answering questions as we go through. And in terms of expectations of engagement, please use the chat facility. I'm certainly I'm focused on the presentation for you. So, but I know that Sat and the rest of the team are working hard on the in the chat area, and so any questions that I don't see that pop up, Sat is going to sort of break my train of thought and interrupt, especially if there's a theme of questions around particular issues. We will take a chunk of time though, at two particular points in the presentation to answer any of the things that are left outstanding there, particularly at the very end. Twice, as Sat mentioned through the presentation, there will be an opportunity to answer polls that will pop up on your screen as well about getting more information from you about the importance of workplace violence prevention. Q&A is going to happen again. If you've got a question, other people will have the same question, so please ask away. There are tools and resources available for you. I'm going to sort of point out a bunch of resources that I have here available, and certainly the health and safety handbook that I know the organization has put together is a massively important tool. Fantastic development process went behind it. So, but there's always more information that I think you can glean from random conversations that you have with people, and I've certainly got access to a ton of resources here for you if you want to reach out. And at the end of, for me really, at the end of today's webinar, I'm going to ask you a really important question, and it's that: what are you going to do after you've sat through this 3-hour workshop this morning? What is the benefit to you and your organization and your staff going to be? What is the one action item? And I'm going to ask you to sort of pop that into the chat area. So not only you can, when we actually tell someone what we're going to do, there's a little bit of sort of forced accountability there, but when you're telling 150 other people what we're going to do, then there's a real accountability. And other people may get ideas about what they can do from what you share with them as well. So that's that's a sort of, that will be the exam, I suppose, that we're going to have later on. What are you going to do? No wrong answer. So why is this training important in the first place? Why are we doing this? Well, the yes, from a occupational health and safety regulatory point of view, you as if you're representatives of the ownership of your organization have a legal responsibility to provide a safe workplace for your staff. But what we're really trying to do here, I think, is have a conversation about how we go around making good decisions before we actually need to make those decisions. And what I'm saying by that is we're talking about the preventative nature of our mindset here. So what we are looking at is how can we prepare ahead of time for something that we hope never happens, but there's a good chance it perhaps will when you're dealing with other human beings. And so what we want to do is think about, okay, what are the decisions that I need to make now so that when I'm in that moment, the decision's already made, I don't have to go through a sort of a process of, of umming and ahhing. It's very similar to, if you remember when we used to fly around in airplanes, that when the flight attendant, before the plane has even moved out of the gate at the airport, they will say, please lean forward and take out that the laminated card in front of you and have a look around for your emergency exits. And by the way, it might even be right behind you there. So have that sort of situational awareness. Make the decision about how you're going to get out of that airplane should an emergency actually happen. And so you're making the decision beforehand. So, because what they don't do is they don't wait until you're flying along at 25,000 feet and all of a sudden something happens and you're hurtling to the ground. Then they don't do it then. They don't say, please, reach forward now and take your emergency card out. Because what's happening for us at that particular point as human beings is that we're suffering from something called, this fight or flight response. It's officially called the anger arousal cycle, really, where our brain is, one of its main functions is to keep us safe every day. And so it's scanning our environment the whole time like a bit of a radar, and it's looking for things that it can identify as a risk to you. A scream, a car door slamming next to you, screech of brakes in front of you, anything that sort of freaks us out and shocks us a little bit, and you have that sort of that momentary jump. And what happens at that particular point, and all of us have had those experiences, what happens is that we go into this sort of fight or flight response where our heart rate immediately increases. And what happens is when our heart rate is increasing, blood is flowing right from our brain into our major muscle groups. It does so instantly in the form of adrenaline to make sure we have enough power to either fight for our life or run for our life. But at the very time we're doing that, because our brain is deprived of the very thing it needs to make really smart decisions here, you can see the blue line on the lower, a quality of your decision making actually goes down. So we tend to make poor decisions when we're in this sort of anger arousal cycle. And you may have had experiences in your life where that's been the case as well. So what we want to do today is eliminate this by making smart decisions before we even have one of these moments, because then you know exactly what we're going to be. You've already made the decision. And you can sort of zoom out of that situation quite clearly. So we want to eliminate this fight or flight response by being prepared always ahead of time in how to respond to situations. So that's really the sort of focus of where we're going today. And we're going to cover a whole bunch of things. So I thought you would like this analogy, maybe using a multi-tool. Many of you may have one of these sort of multi-tools or a Swiss Army knife. And if I asked you the question, have you ever used all of the tools that it possesses at the same time? Likely the answer is going to be no. And that would probably be a really bad day for you if you'd used all of them at the same time. But the longer that you own this piece of equipment, this tool, the more likely you are to use every single one of them at some point, making your investment in purchasing this tool much more valuable the longer that you own it. Well, that's the analogy that I'm using for today's workshop, webinar, is that we're going to talk about a bunch of things today in the next 3 hours. And this is your sort of curriculum, I suppose, for the workshop here. And you won't need all of them at the same time. If you do, that's a really bad day for you in your particular organization. But the longer that you deal with human beings, the longer you're working in the environment where you happen to be, the more likely you are going to need one of these things at some point, making your investment in today's webinar much more valuable. So thank you again. It's a real privilege to be here working for you, and hopefully I'll be providing some information. And maybe I'll actually not even teach you anything you don't know. Maybe I'll just reinforce things that you already know, but I'll maybe be reinforcing them in a way that makes sense from a different perspective and reminds you of why they work so well. So starting at the bottom of the screen here, we want to talk about WorkSafe BC. We were one of the very first provinces across the country in the late 1990s to actually have legislation that mandated organizations, the ownership of organizations, to do a bunch of things for their staff. And as we go around from the sort of 6 o'clock mark, the policies, risk assessment, training, and investigations. Those are the 4 things that we're going to sort of primarily sort of talk about to begin with. And where the legislation came from in British Columbia was a series of incidents that were happening in one particular industry. And still today, if you punched into a search engine, which industry has the most incidents of workplace violence, and hit the enter button, up will pop likely healthcare. But there's a word that's missing from that question, because it really should read, which industry has the most reported incidents of workplace violence? Enter healthcare, because healthcare has an almost fanatical reporting level. I guarantee if we pulled all of our histories, our collective histories together and said, okay, in all the time you've been dealing with human beings in your particular situations here in your organizations, has every single incident of workplace violence been reported? And the answer is absolutely going to be no. You know, I was doing a session for a municipality on Friday morning, and we had an incident shared in the class where there was at the front counter of this municipal hall, a bucket of, as well as a container of pens that was picked up by a member of the public that was angry about something, and hurled it almost like a series of arrows at the front counter staff. Not reported, not told to the supervisor. And so even today, we are underreporting so much, and sat in his statistics. So if we think if those are underreported, what is the real situation out there? So this is a really valuable conversation we're going to have. So we were one of the first provinces across the country. The whole country, provincially and territorially, is covered now, and you may have seen the legislation in federally sort of caught up at the beginning of the year as well. So the whole country is sort of covered with very similar legislation to deal with workplace violence prevention. The 4 things primarily that you have as a representative of the employer need to have in place: policies and procedures, and those are living documents, by the way. They're not something you stick away and cover in dust. Because your organization ebbs and flows, new situations become known to people. Maybe you've never had a situation that may happen tomorrow, and so there's got to be safe work practices developed to deal with that. We can't have a policy that deals with every possible iteration that could potentially happen, because it will be a massive document. But what we need to do is have a sort of a sense of what are the things that are likely to happen, and let's deal with those. And we find out the answer to what is likely to happen from doing risk assessments. Now, I'm a huge fan of risk assessments, and yes, you can hire someone to come in and do so objectively, and that's great. But often the people that have the best ideas as to how to elevate and upgrade the safety of a workplace is actually the frontline staff that work there each and every day. So a risk assessment is really an ongoing process, an ongoing conversation that should happen in an organization. And I'm going to tell you about some great results that have happened in different organizations, and one in particular about empowering frontline staff to come up with improving ideas. Training is another opportunity, so welcome to today. And despite policies being in place, risk assessments having occurred, training having happened, it's no guarantee that there's not going to be an incident tomorrow of workplace violence. And so we need to take that incident and say, it's unfortunate that this has happened, but what can we learn from it? What can we, let's look at the causal factors. Let's look at the contributing causes here. What is the root cause of this particular thing? And then let's tackle that from, using that classic hierarchy of controls. Can we eliminate it? Well, you're not going to be eliminating people for sure. So what are the other options in terms of what we can do? So because we need to be learning from the past. Otherwise, history will repeat itself, guaranteed. So those are the 4 things that I'm sort of really passionate about. And in my policing career, I can tell you that starting off on day one of my policing career in the late 70s in London, in Notting Hill. If you ever saw the movie, that's where I grew up as a police officer. I had my nose broken on day one of my policing career because I wasn't ready for a situation. I waited too long to act. I had this pause in my sort of sequence of steps, and someone took advantage of that. I ended up, detaining that person, taking them back to the police station with my face covered in blood, and my supervisor, when I walked into the booking office with this chap in handcuffs, took one look at me and said, "Welcome to policing, Phil." Like, there wasn't a great deal of emphasis placed on personal safety. And then there was a tragedy a few months later when a good friend of mine succumbed to a needle prick injury where he died of hepatitis. And when we looked at how that incident had happened, everyone said, "Oh, you know what? It was just a matter of time before someone got hurt that way." And this was a fatality, unfortunately. So everyone knew about the risk, but no one did anything about it until something tragic actually happened. So we're not going to do that ever again. We are going to, if we know about the risk, we are going to do something about it now before it becomes a tragedy or an injury. So that's going to be the focus. We'll find out what the risks are, tackle them. Is it a guarantee we're going to eliminate everything? No. Can we mitigate as much as we can? Yes. But it's a collective effort. It's not one person's responsibility. It's all of ours. We're going to talk about conflict resolution this morning as well. I'm going to introduce you to a program called Verbal Judo. You may well be aware of it if you're trained in the nonviolent crisis intervention. Similar sort of sequence of steps. This was developed by a chap called George Thompson a number of years ago, and it's a solid process that is being used around the world in many different sort of forms. But it's a verbal de-escalation technique with a sort of a consequence question towards the very end. We're going to talk about the police. We're going to talk about a couple of definitions within the criminal code of a criminal threat, of a criminal assault. And I know that, from a criminal point of view, there's always that requirement to have that mens rea, that mental capacity to actually make a decision to do something deliberately, intentionally. And there may be individuals on this call where they work in situations where that mens rea may be sort of awkward sometimes. But I can tell you that, and again, I'm going to refer to this document a couple of times because you really need, and you'll see it's on one of the slides, the definition of aggression, the definition of violence. It's not focused on. It's actually focused on the actual act rather than the intent behind the act. So it's really important that we get clear on what we're talking about today, for sure. We're going to talk about sort of the unpredictability of people sometimes in different situations. And, we're not going to be specifically providing training for any particular group. It's more about how we can manage ourselves in those groups. We can't control anyone. All we have absolute control over is our response to people, our reaction to people. And we're going to talk about team building as well. So, because really you've got an opportunity to make sure that when we work together, if I've got a teammate, if I've got a colleague of mine that I know, if I've got a supportive organization, I show up much more competently, I show up much more confidently. If I'm concerned about, whether I've got backup, whether I'm doing the right thing, I will often sort of turn up in a tentative way, as I did on that first day of my policing career. And when you're tentative, often that can lead you into distress sometimes. And also people can take advantage of that. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And let's get going. There are some myths I want to debunk straight away, and you may not be aware of these myths, but I'm going to tell you what they are and then debunk them straight away. Firstly, people sometimes think that it's someone else's job to do with workplace violence prevention. It's not the frontline employee, it's not all the staff, it's the Occupational Health and Safety Committee if you've got an organization of over 20 people, it's the ownership, it's the board, whoever it is. It's not me. It's up the organizational chart somewhere. Wrong. It is everyone's responsibility for workplace violence prevention. One of our clients that I feel I can confidently tell you about is BC Ferries. My company does they've been a client of mine for 25 years. We do all of their workplace violence prevention training around the fleet. And they had a tragedy a number of years ago when they lost a ship with a loss of 2 lives. You may remember that in British Columbia here, the Queen of the North. And what happened as a result of that big investigation, which was headed by a chap called George Morfitt, was that about 9 months later, so in January or April of 2007, the Morfitt report came out, and One of the things that was highlighted in the Morfitt report was the fact that they needed to refocus the culture of the organization on safety, making safety everyone's priority, not just the safety committee, not just Mike Corrigan, the CEO at the time, everyone's job. And so they not rebranded, but they came out with a safety management system that was basically and trained everyone in the importance of safety in all of its guises. And it took a while, but 10 years later, in 2017, they were voted the safest passenger ferry company on the planet at a big award in Singapore. And the CEO at that time went over there and was grateful for the award, but he basically spent a lot of time talking about the importance of the frontline staff realizing that their job was safety for their staff, for themselves, for their colleagues, and for the passengers. And so when we realize that our job, every one of us, everyone in your organizations, is workplace violence prevention, and using some of the tools and resources and ideas and concepts I'm going to share with you this morning. If we can do that, it may take it'll be incremental improvement, but basically that incremental improvement has a cumulative effect down the road, and all of a sudden, the organizations become a lot safer for people to be in. So one of them is to retool our mindsets that it's everyone's job in terms to focus on workplace violence prevention. Another myth in some organizations, which feel relatively safe sometimes, is that it can't happen here. That's going to happen somewhere else. Well, I live in Lynn Valley, and not so long ago, there was an absolute tragedy just down the hill here at Lynn Valley Public Library, where a person, as far as I am aware from the news, a stranger to BC, a stranger to Lynn Valley, a stranger to North Vancouver, took the life of someone, stabbing 6 people and fatally injuring 1 person in a public library. So, when you look at it, can happen anywhere. So we need to sort of debunk the myth of there are some safe workplaces and not. When you've got humans in the equation, anything can happen. So we need to sort of understand this applies in all of our workplaces. We often think that workplace violence is caused by someone that comes in, perhaps like the chap down in Lynn Valley Public Library, but actually statistically, workplace violence, and I'm sure that the stats that SAT has, and definitely I know from the work that we do, internationally even, the statistics that we look at, most of the incidents of workplace violence happen by someone that either has a legitimate reason to be using your services or knows someone in the building and in the facility and comes to that person to cause problems, or is in a relationship or was in a relationship with that person. And we'll talk about those sources for sure, but it's not generally caused by outsiders. It's caused by people that actually are using our services for a legitimate reason. And the last one is people just think, well, what can we do? It's just a matter of luck whether it happens or not. Well, that may be, but there's so much we can do to prevent or minimize that luck from even happening. So this is the prevention of workplace violence, not how to fix it after it's happened. I mean, there is that part of the conversation, but this is all about what can we do ahead of time to mitigate or minimize the chance of it ever happening in the first place. So it's not just a matter of luck. There's tons and tons that we can do. So I know you're all excited to get on, so let's do it. So these are the 4 things that, from a WorkSafe point of view, I want to focus on. We've already talked a little bit about risk assessments, and they really, that's an ongoing conversation. Not just when we do an official risk assessment, not just when we're going for core certification, but but basically every day, what can we do to improve workplaces? And those frontline staff are definitely going to have the best ideas. The policies and procedures, those are the documents that need to be, no one needs to know what frontline staff don't need to understand what they say, line by line, but they do need to understand the philosophy behind them, and certainly have an understanding that they are available and need to be reviewed on a regular basis to make sure they're relevant. I remember growing up in the police department in London, and one of the policies that they said at the training school, and you had to read all of them and know all of them for an exam purposes. One of them was, a procedure on how to catch a runaway horse. Well, I worked in London for 8 years, and not once in Notting Hill did I ever see a runaway horse. It's so it obviously hadn't been reviewed since Robert Peel had written a procedure in 1839, when I'm sure there were lots of runaway horses in London. So it needs to be relevant for your workplace and the time that and today, obviously. And the instruction of workers needs to happen. It's not just, this just shouldn't be lip service. I mean, we did a session even yesterday evening for an organization, and there was a participant in the class that she said she's married to a police officer, and yet she learned so much even in the session. So I think anytime we can have a conversation with our staff and give them ideas and tools and resources and make them think about personal safety, it's a valuable opportunity. But when we go to the definition, the top bullet point here, most people, you know, in public, I suppose, think that workplace violence has to involve that. It has to involve pain, it has to involve damage, it has to involve an injury, but actually, no. And the definition for workplace violence is actually taken in part from one of the criminal code offenses of an assault, where you're not even touched, but someone does something that scares you, that feels your safety is at risk connected to your workplace. It's a really broad definition of workplace violence, which is why I often think that people underreport, because they don't even know sometimes that there's actually been an incident. So I think education is a big part of this, and bringing people's awareness up so that they understand exactly what is being, what we're talking about here. Okay, let's get going. I'm going to ask sort of randomly, occasionally, and I will do it shortly, whether this is valuable information. I know that Sat and Fiona and Candice and David and the team will be interested in the answer to that. Let's walk through the various types of workplace violence that there are out there. And organizationally, they can be called type 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4. But we're going to just call them, firstly, stranger violence. So this is the individual that has no connection to your organization. They're not a constituent. They're not a user of your services. They have no connection to you or anyone in your organization. They may not even be a resident of the community in which your facility is based. Randomly walks in and causes a problem. That's the sort of stranger, the person that has no connection to either a victim or the organization or anything like that. So perhaps, as far as we know, the person in Lynn Valley, there was a situation in an Abbotsford High School not so long ago, where that may have been the case as well. But not relatively, but very, very small in terms of the percentages of the reported incidents that we are aware of. What the legislation was originally designed to deal with is the person that has a legitimate use of your services, or a person that's within your organization. So this is the customer or the client or the constituent, and whatever it is, this is the person to whom you are providing a service or who's touched by your service for sure. And this is so from a healthcare point of view, where the legislation came from, we are looking at, this is the patient, this is the visitor, this is the person randomly walking through the hospital or the pharmacy or the clinic. And for you, you're going to know exactly who this person is, in terms of not necessarily who they are, but in terms of what the use of the sort of definition of the person that uses your services. That's traditionally what we think of as the reason that we developed workplace violence prevention legislation. In British Columbia's history, it wasn't until 2003 that we added the phrase co-worker to where the source of your problem might come from. So we want to talk about that, because some of your organizations will be really large, and certainly there's going to be conflict within the work group sometimes, which might escalate into workplace violence for sure. And so there was a tragedy a number of years ago in the Okanagan, where a manager for the Ministry of Water, Land and Air Protection was fired from his job and came back shortly after and took the life of the manager that fired him, person from Victoria that came up and assisted with the exit interview, and then took his own life. And in the aftermath of that investigation, they're saying, how the heck did that happen, that tragedy? There was lots of warning signs that were not reported by staff members about this person's escalating behavior and the threats that he had made should he ever be fired. And people thought he was having a bad day, thought it was just a one-off. There was no sequence of events. And when we don't report, we don't give ourselves an opportunity to put together a pattern of behavior. Why report? Another reason why reporting and documentation is so important is to give people the opportunity of seeing sequence of events and maybe an escalation of behavior, so it doesn't come out, so it's not like a one-off and therefore not taken, not given the seriousness that it needs. But if we put together a pattern of behavior, and that's why another reason why the documentation is so vital, and why we put ourselves at risk if we don't document everything. So as a result of that situation, there was the regulations were upgraded to talk about the risk of a coworker being the source of a problem. The last type 4 source of workplace violence is this relationship violence, and this is either there's a number of potential sources. It could be it's likely we're talking about an intimate partner relationship or an ex-intimate partner relationship. So it's like a ex-boyfriend, ex-girlfriend, ex-partner, spouse, common law, whatever the situation is, and that person comes to the workplace to cause trauma and grief for the ex-partner or the partner, and maybe even hurt someone else in the process. And across the country, provincially and territorially, we were one of the first. Ontario was actually the very last in 2010, and that was triggered by a terrible incident that took place in a hospital in Windsor, where an emergency room nurse called Laurie Dupont her life was taken by her recent ex-boyfriend, who was an anesthetist that worked in the hospital as well. And no one knew the trauma of the relationship that Laurie was suffering at the hands of her boyfriend, a very violent man outside of work. But she confided in one of her friends, who was also an emergency room nurse, and said, please don't tell anyone. I'm going to deal with this. I just need to deal with it on my terms and in my time. Well, she never had the opportunity of doing that. And the friend kept her promise, which she bitterly regretted. And so when the legislation came out in Ontario, and it was initially called Laurie's Law, you may remember we had a tragedy in Maple Ridge where Grant's Law became the elimination of why we all prepay for gas now. The risk to people working at gas stations has been absolutely eliminated in terms of the risk that Grant DePady suffered because he stepped out in front of an unsafe situation to prevent someone from leaving with $11 worth of gas in their car. That has been eliminated. And Laurie's Law was designed to eliminate the risk of relationship violence happening, connected to a workplace. And so when Bill 168 sort of emerged, part of that legislation, which we imported into our British Columbia legislation, talks about relationship violence. And it says that, if you are aware of someone in your workplace that is in one of those relationships, such as I've described with Laurie, you need to consider talking to someone in human resources about that, because it's a safety risk, and we want to make sure that we are alive to it, because the hospital was not aware of that situation, even though 2 people knew about it and never shared it. So it's really important that when we look at the types of workplace violence, you may have come here today thinking, okay, we're just talking about one group, but actually there are 4 established groups that are going to be sort of referred throughout through the workshop today. And I want us to sort of, in our own situations, think about, okay, what can we do more of in order to elevate the level of safety for our staff, for the organization, based on what Phil's talking about here. So how can we prepare? Because this is called the prevention of workplace violence. Well, there's a number of things. In fact, I've got 7 of them for you that I would like to talk about today. There's obviously lots more, but the main ones I think I want to share first of all would be these. So under time and distance, this is in reference to the fact that we don't all have to be, and you don't need to be, an Olympic caliber athlete in order to run fast. In order to cover enormous distances in a relatively short space of time, you don't need to be athletically inclined at all. All you need to be is highly motivated. I am not athletically inclined at all, but give me enough motivation, you'll be shocked at how fast I can move. So what happens for us in workplaces, I truly believe, is that we see someone quite some distance away from us, other side of the lobby, across the car park, whatever it happens to be, and they're kicking up a bit of a fuss, they're acting out maybe, but we immediately sort of do a scan of them and think, phew, they're so far away from me, they're not going to be a problem to me. And we go back to doing what we're doing. And then all of a sudden, hey, I'm talking to you. And the person has suddenly moved from way over there to now here. And we are shocked and freaked out. And all of a sudden we go into that fight or flight response, which we know, because I told you earlier on, we are unlikely to make, as a group, smart decisions in that moment of potential crisis. So the idea here is not to ignore people that are some distance away from us, that we may initially make an assumption or a judgment about, oh yeah, I've got safe distance here. That doesn't work, because we get distracted for a moment, and all of a sudden we take our eyes off the potential risk, and all of a sudden the risk moves from way there to here. You'll have had this experience, I hope not, but maybe you have, where you're driving along in your car and the car in front of you is so far away, like they're half a block maybe. There's no risk of you rear-ending anyone right now because there's nothing between you and that car way down there. And then all of a sudden you get distracted, you're talking to someone in the car, and all of a sudden you turn to face the windshield, and the car that was way down there is now sitting right in front of you, stationary with brake lights on. And you jam on the anchors and you come to a screeching halt, and you have this almost visceral response going through your body. And then you'll never do that again. Like, it's fight or flight, right? That's what we're doing. So just pay attention to the risk, even though you may consider them to be so far away. Because definitely that forewarned is definitely forearmed. If we're ready for something to happen, chances are it never is. But when we're not ready, that's when it happens all the time. So, that's one thing I wanted to share with you. The second thing is this: people behave very differently in groups. The pack mentality, the group think is a real thing. And people do silly, ridiculous things when other people are around doing silly, ridiculous things as well. And in fact, people don't, if you, the latest and most memorable, well, no, maybe not the latest, but the most memorable example of this. And I was the watch commander in New West Police when this happened, so I can remember the date. It was July the 12th, 2011. That was the day, the evening, when the Canucks came that close to winning it all against Boston. And a bunch of people downtown in Vancouver decided to sort of vent how they felt about that. So the vast majority of people that were either arrested charged, or pled guilty, or found guilty, or participating in a public riot that night, that the biggest majority of the people had never really had any negative contact with the police before in their lives. But on that night, you may remember the images, people thought it was okay to chuck smart cars through coffee shop windows, loot London drugs, and set fire to VPD vehicles. Like, people do silly things. I mean, the poster child of that evening was a kid that was from Maple Ridge and had full-line scholarships lined up for water polo in the States, and no negative contact with the police, but he's the one that's lighting a rag that he jammed into the back of a police car gas tank. And all of a sudden, what happens when one person in a group does something silly, a lot of other people think that that's now the standard. So this is a really risky situation for anyone when there's a group of, when there's multiple people that are anxious, that are frustrated, that are potentially angry, because it will take one person to do something, and then all of a sudden other people sort of follow suit. So how we can deal with this is, firstly, if you're on your own, this is a very unsafe situation. So there's lots of me thinking, okay, you have the right to refuse unsafe work, so maybe leave if you can. Certainly getting help with other people. So that's where teamwork comes in. That's where acknowledging that we can support our colleagues. And when this person's on their own, they're not necessarily feeling that confident. Add a colleague or two if that's available, and all of a sudden there's a lot more confidence, there's a lot more competence, and I'm better able to handle the group. Diffusing a group is tough. What I would suggest, if you want to try some really great conflict resolution verbal tactics here, is inviting the person who is talking the most, inviting them to step back with you and have a conversation away from the audience. And it's a great question to ask the person whether they're willing to do that, because if they are interested and willing to do that, it means they actually want to be helped. They actually want to be heard. They actually want to have a problem, hopefully sorted out by you. But if they don't want to leave the group, it should send, that's a clue that the person is more comfortable staying with their group. And that is a clue that this is not a safe situation for you to remain in. So it's a bit of a sort of a litmus test as to how are we doing here? What's the situation going to do? So more people would be helpful for you, or leaving more people, or inviting. You cannot diffuse a group. You can diffuse one person, and by the way, that person will like to become a lot more reasonable when they're actually away from the group, and the group may actually just wander away because they've lost their the person that was the sort of spokesperson, if you like. So there's lots of things that we can do with group dynamics, but there's just a couple of ideas. One of the things that we tend to do is that we we often, make a judgment very quickly about someone's threat potential to us. We look at a person and we say, oh, they look older than us, they look weaker than us, they look frailer than us, they look, um, you know, uh, smaller than us. They're not going to be a problem. We sort of judge them straight away with our ability to handle things. But actually, and that lulling ourselves into that false sense of security is exactly what that is. Because the only thing that is going to dictate whether that person is going to be aggressive with you is what is going on inside their head, and you don't know that from the outside. So often we make a big wrong assumptions about whether someone's going to be a problem for us based on what our initial size up is of them. So and we get it all wrong. The other thing that I wanted to talk to you about is the definition of a weapon. Now, in the Criminal Code of Canada, a weapon is simply described as anything that is either made or used to cause injury or harm. So it's not just the knife or the gun, which are made to cause injury or harm. It is anything used. So it's the baseball bat. It is the hockey stick. It is a hot cup of coffee. It is the bucket of pens that was thrown at the staff member the other day. It is a pair of scissors that was used, to jam into someone's wrist at a counter when they're trying to rip off at a recreation center a band that had been put on that got sticky and sort of glued to someone's wrist after the swimming pool. And so sometimes we actually give people weapons in a way. There was a situation at a municipal hall where an angry resident came into the hall and dumped a huge bag of garbage on the middle of the city hall, and basically with a big announcement saying, "Hey, you missed the garbage pickup again. I told you if it happens again, I'm going to bring it down here, and you've missed me, so here it is." And he basically dumps this bag of garbage right onto the floor of City Hall. All this green, ugly liquid is spilling out all over the floor, and it's almost like a hazmat situation. A staff member who was really upset at this guy doing this wandered over with a bucket, went out to the building service worker's office, picked up a mop and a bucket, and basically marched out to this guy and said, "Clean this up." And the guy took the mop basically and whacked the staff member around the head with it. So sometimes we actually, not through thinking about what a weapon looks like, give people the tools to use against us. So where I'm going with this is, do you have in your organizations, do you have an environment at the lobby or where sometimes people are getting upset? Do you have stuff around there that can go airborne? Even your computer monitor, is it bolted to the table, or can someone lift it up and hurl it at someone? So we need to be, I'm not trying to make everyone paranoid, but I'm just thinking about, okay, what can we do to prevent these things from escalating? And are there things in our general working environment that are inanimate objects, which is basically what we're talking about? They don't have a sticker on them saying this is a weapon. We need to be thinking about, what can become a weapon. And if you've seen any of the Jason Bourne movies, you know what he can do with a pin. So it's one of those things where we want to be looking at our workplaces through a different sort of set of lenses, which is why involving everyone in the conversation will produce some great ideas and suggestions. It really will. The world's second most popular sport, soccer, the first one being cricket, of course. Maybe not of course, but it is. The referee has two colored cards. And this is about special knowledge. Special knowledge. So that what we're talking about here is, do you have documented history of someone doing something aggressive, committing a foul, playing outside the code of conduct, the expectations, the rules of expectations for your organization? Has someone done it in the past? Because if they have, they need not to be sort of watched intently, but you just need to keep an eye on them, because if they've got past, from a human resources point of view, it's about, if you've got past performance, documented past performance, there's a potential you could do it in the future. So the referee, has 22 players to keep an eye on, and when the referee issues a warning card, that yellow card, to a player, he or she is saying to that player, "Hey, I'm calling you on your behavior. And even though they've got 22 players to keep an eye on, they really do pay attention to the players to whom they've already issued that yellow card, because there's a strong likelihood is that if anyone's going to foul, it's going to be someone that's got documented history of problems in the past. So one of the things, another reason to document, but it's another thing to why we always talk about in our workshops about when someone comes into your organization, always acknowledge the presence of someone, verbally acknowledge their presence. When you walk into a store that you've not been into before, just do this as a little bit of a test for next time. Does the clerk say, "Good morning, can I help you?" Because if they do, I love that. And a big reason that they do that is obviously called customer service. But a small reason why they do that is called crime prevention, because you're less likely to shoplift from a store where you have been verbally acknowledged in terms of your presence there. And also, when we verbally acknowledge people, other staff members that may be busy with other stuff and maybe not paying attention to who's in our environment will hear that and be alerted to the fact that maybe someone else is there that they should be paying attention to. So it's just a way, it's about that acknowledgement of everyone, but paying particular attention to those people that have got a history, because we are less likely, if we feel we're being, that someone a person in a position of authority, which is what you're called, has seen us and has acknowledged our presence. I also like signs. Now, I think that you can perhaps have too many signs, but I really like the idea of having signs about expectations of behaviors. If you've been into VGH emergency department in the last few years, actually, you will have seen the first thing you'll have seen walking in after the COVID times is one of these. In fact, multiples of these. They're all over the place. I'm going to show you in a second how many there are and how big they are. This was a suggestion that came out of a brainstorming session of frontline employees about how we can elevate the importance and the visibility, I suppose, of our zero tolerance policy for not only violence, but it includes physical assaults, verbal threats, and aggressive behavior. So that what they are doing here at Vancouver Coastal Health is basically taking that whole definition of workplace violence and addressing all of the various elements of it. So what they came up with was a really cool program to put these posters everywhere. Have a look at this. And that last shot was what you see when you walk into Vancouver Emergency Department right now. So I'm a huge fan of signs. Why I'm a huge fan of signs, and particularly ones that people, where staff members, as in those three situations there, they use actual people that work in the organization. It's like, when you're driving along the highway, you've seen those cone zone signs that say, slow down. As a person in full high vis gear, my dad or my uncle works here, sort of thing. So why I like signs is that they add credibility to the framework that the staff member has to describe to someone in a potential de-escalation or consequences situation. It basically, if you didn't have a sign in your organization, any sort of reference to this is okay, we don't put up with violence here, we don't put up with aggressive behavior, we don't put up with any threats, and there's going to be consequences for that. I mean, whatever that language is, and it'll be better than that later on this morning. But it might sound like someone's personal standard that they are coming up with, unless you have supporting documentation in the form of a sign. So I think you've got to be careful with signs, but if you were to go onto a search engine and look for workplace violence prevention signs, you'll see a wide variety of them. My particular favorite are the ones there, and I know that in Fraser Health they have a slightly different version, but they use them in the Fraser Health region as well. So you can come up with, plus it's another, for the staff member, it's another supportive statement, I suppose, from the employer that we care about you and we're going to do everything we possibly can to keep you as safe as possible under the circumstances, basically. So another thing is being aware of your situation, creating situational awareness. Well, how do you get situational awareness? Well, it's basically about looking around you. If we go back to the example that I shared with you earlier on about the flight attendant saying, "Take the seat, the emergency thing outside of you in the airplane, and look around you. The exit sign could be behind you." If you've ever done, if you've ever been trained professionally by doing defensive driving, and you've actually not only taken a defensive driving program, but you've actually gone out for a drive with the instructor, and the instructor has told you, okay, what I want you to do is verbalize every single hazard as we're driving along. If you've seen those motorcycle teams that got, not motorcycle teams, but those motorcycle schools, so the instructor is riding behind, and he's listening, and she's listening to all of the verbal commentary of the riders, because obviously you can't, in the car, so you've got to verbalize out loud, and they've got the headsets and listen. And what you're doing is you're ensuring that you demonstrate you've got great situational awareness. And it's not about watching the car in front of you. It's about watching the car 6, 7 in front of you, the traffic lights, the weather conditions, the road conditions, the speed of your vehicle, the speed limit on the road. You're supposed to look in your mirrors, right, once every 3 to 4 seconds. And that's great situational awareness if you're able to continue doing that, because what you may, by elevating your level of situational awareness, looking out for hazards, if they're there, you will see them and you can become prepared for them. If you're looking for them and they are not there, it's all good. So, but if you're not even paying attention and know what you're looking for, then then that creates huge risk. The last one I'm just going to share with you is about the exit strategy that you have to have. So this is a hugely important one, and so what we're talking about here is, in any given situation in your particular organizational makeup, in the geography of your building, of your facility, wherever you happen to be working, um, is there an exit behind where the staff are likely to be in a situation where they're confronted, where an upset person is going to be? Or is the exit the other side of that person, just because of we've never had a problem here before, we didn't really think about it when we were designing it? Sometimes meeting rooms are done that way. We have a significant meeting with someone, we invite them into what we think is a safe meeting room, and all of a sudden we are sitting on the wrong side of the table, and the aggressor is sitting between us and freedom. So it's really, really important that we always have an exit strategy. And part of this, especially if we are in a situation, and again, the health and safety handbook here is a great resource. When we start talking about working alone or in isolation policies, if you've got staff members that are working on their own or do not have immediate ability to call for assistance, what is their exit strategy if things go wrong at that particular situation? What is how do they call for backup? How do they get out of that situation? And one of the things is, so if you've got it could be as simple as thinking about, okay, do you have a chaperone system for staff members leaving late at night, when it's dark in the wintertime, and they are going past an area where there's risky sort of behavior that's outside your buildings, perhaps. One of our clients is a provincial organization, and they've moved their brand new headquarters right down onto Pandora Avenue in the city of Victoria. And they were somewhere else before, but they built this standalone building, and all of a sudden they realized even the brand new building had to be retrofitted. Like, the brand new building was retrofitted in the lobby area, when they suddenly realized they hadn't factored in different situations that they had never experienced before. So it's one of those things where we want to be thinking about, okay, here's our workplace. Now, if something went wrong here, how do we get out quickly? How do we get out safely? And it's a really important conversation. Do you have emergency alert buttons and things? Do you have do you have that sort of check-in system? The working alone or isolation program was part of it. Was the reason we have it here is it was born out of a tragedy that happened with you may remember the two ferries that were part of the Albion ferry service that used to run between Fort Langley and Maple Ridge, and at night they would tie up on the north side, and the single engineer that was working on those two ferries overnight you know, ended up in the Fraser River and succumbed, and they weren't they didn't know whether it was, you know, self-harm, trip and fall, someone threw them in, but they realized there was no sort of check-in with that individual. So all of a sudden, that out of the inquest came the requirement for us to have working alone or isolation policies reinforced. And you've probably got one, but is it talked about a lot? Or are there situations where people just sort of get through stuff and they don't really enact the policy because it's never applied to them, they thought, or they've never had an issue? And what happens when we start to, when we have a safety program, but we don't use it, that, that, that's a risk. You know, it sort of elevates that risk. It's like having you've probably seen organizations that have a sort of like a half door between a public area where people come into the front counter and the staff area. And as soon as it's a bit of a pain sometimes for the staff to always have to lean over and flick the switch. So sometimes they just leave it open and they tape it open so you can just sort of freely walk backwards and forwards. But that's part of your security system. Like that's part of, from a crime prevention through environmental design philosophy, that's part of the distance between a private area and a semi-public or semi-private area. And if you just open the door, you may as well just not have any doors at all. So it's about always thinking about what is our exit strategy in different situations, and does everyone know about them? Because the last thing you want to do is start thinking about how to get out of there when actually something happens. So let's do the flight attendant thing. Let's look at our emergency exits and our strategies and have a conversation about how to get out of there before anything happens. Okay, I'm going to take a breath. Sats, do you want to come on live now and just tell me how things, are there questions that I should be paying attention to here?
No, thanks, Phil. No, at this point, we don't really have very many questions. You're most welcome to continue if you feel, we're able to. I do want to be mindful that, we're talking about community social services. And so we're looking at a number of participants that are a part of a larger portfolio. So we have a number of folks that are from registered, part of this session, from harm reduction, from Indigenous services, from immigrant service organizations, from community living organizations, and also businesses as well that are part of the classification unit structure as well. And so the application of identification of violence in the workplace is such a critical one. And I think that, I found myself nodding my head through your first part of the presentation, going like, yes, that's right. How do we address this? And organizations are doing so much with so little and are constantly trying to, be positioned in a way that they are safeguarding to the best of their abilities, their employees, their organizations, and coming up with robust and creative ways, to be frank, on good policies and processes. So at this point, yeah, absolutely. I think, in my former life, working in with immigrant services and working in harm reduction and working with community living, I did find myself kind of shaking my head, going like, "Oh, that makes a lot of sense." And so, um, I think it's really great information that you're sharing. Some of this, yes, it's very familiar for folks. Some are not, and some are validating, and it's sort of part of that exercise. And again, I think one of the key things in this presentation is to create a baseline or get some, understanding of what's happening, but also what's happening in other industries in comparison to what we're dealing with. And if there, obviously, there is best practices. And so let's start to see where we can, get in tune with that. And I believe that at the council, that's one of our main objectives, is to create a best practices piece. That being said, we are in the process of creating a violence risk assessment tool for community social services, which will be released later this year. And so we're very excited. The council is very excited about that. And it will be that outline that will be available for everyone to look at. And it will, again, validate or help support, what are those best practices that are required in our sector. One of the key things that I think that is really critical is that our industry is so diverse. It's so unique. And, coupled with that, organizations are, in metropolis areas to rural areas to isolated areas, remote areas, and we need to be, very cognizant of that. One part of an item that you brought up was around isolation and folks working alone. And, there are organizations obviously working, in various communities up north that, there's only one person, working in one particular site and is responsible for so much. And so there are protocols and processes that are in place. But again, I think it's very important that they're checked, they're discussed with employees and the OSH committee and building upon those things. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I see a question in the chat area. So the four types of workplace violence were that stranger, there's that customer or client or the person you are providing the service to, there's that coworker, and then there's the relationship violence. That was the fourth one there. In terms of and I love the quote from Nemo, by the way, in the chat area here. Everyone grab your exit buddy, which is it's about having that we feel much more resilient and confident when we've got other people around us, for sure. One of the things for the remote communities I would suggest is always very helpful. And this is, and I've been to, we do work with organizations up and down the coast of British Columbia, we've been to Fort St. John. We've done a number of work in smaller communities. And I always suggest to them that one of the best things to do, that if there is this element of risk within the organization from from the work that you do or the constituents that you're working with, maybe reaching out to wherever the local RCMP detachment or Indian Services unit is going to be, to provide that, to build that relationship ahead of time. If you need to call them, that they know, what they're going into, what sort of work is being done there. And I always feel that reaching out, rather than waiting for something to happen for that first phone call to occur, doing so proactively is the best way. Because maybe they are not necessarily aware of some of the stuff that goes on because they don't deal with it on a regular basis. And sometimes when you've got when different staff are working in different detachments at different times, there's not that that's not that history sometimes of familiarity that's part of that helpfulness in terms of knowing what has happened before. So I'm going to help you out now. So okay, we'll go back. Thank you then, Sat. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. And please, by all means, folks, chime in if you have questions, and Phil will be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe I would invite people, if you're finding this useful, maybe just let us know as well, because there's more of this that we can, that we want to be of service to you, for sure. In response to coworker violence, what are some tips to help with the reporting process? Yeah, it's really important, and I think that certainly you've got to have firstly a culture of trust in the organization. There's got to be that, and when Sat was just mentioning now, as we're setting up, maybe what we're doing here, we're setting a bench line of safety. So we're elevating the conversation of safety. And that safety needs to be broadcast, that level of safety needs to be broadcast to the staff. So when we talk about zero tolerance in a little while of what our workplace violence prevention policy is supposed to look like, that the staff understand that the co-worker aggression, the co-worker confrontation, the intimidation that happens sometimes in organizations that certainly we have been involved in, is going to, and then of course you've got that it should involve that sort of the discipline issue of that as well, let alone people feeling safe in the workplace. So I really feel that if you have a human resources professional that you have access to, that would be fantastic to sort of help you through that process. Sometimes they can be brought in a consultative role. They don't necessarily, if your organization doesn't necessarily have one in-house, but they often, I think from a safety point of view, not only psychological safety, but physical safety, having professionals that can provide you with resources from a human resources point of view, I think is very valuable. So that would be my sort of first suggestion, for sure. Okay, let's carry on here. We've got a poll that I know is going to pop up sometime on your screen, so I'm just going to alert you to that. I think we're doing okay with that. Oh, there we are. Look at that. Perfect. And hopefully it won't will go away if I move the slide. What's it going to do? No, we're all good. So please feel free to sort of fill that in. Um, I want to talk to you about communication because communication is the foundation of understanding, of of awareness, of de-escalation, of resolution, I think. And we communicate with each other through three basic ways: through the words that we use, that we choose to come out of our mouths, through the tone of those words, the speed of those words, the volume of our words, the inflection that we put on different words, and of course through our nonverbal means, which is the body language. And so when we look at those three elements, and when we're face to face on the telephone, it's a bit different, obviously, but when we're looking at the element of those three elements of our verbal communication, of our communication face to face, these are what we're looking at. And study after study has told us that this is the amount of percentage that we should be paying attention to, or that is sending us messages about those three elements. The 55% of that face to face pie is based on our body language. So it's not just, so our body language tends to send a lot of information to us. And also, we send a lot of information to other people through our body language as well. So it's not only about us interpreting other people, but it's about you sending a message through how you're projecting yourself and the messages that you're sending non-verbally. The 38% is all about that inflection, the speed, the volume, the tone, and the 7% is the actual remaining chunk focusing on the words. So it's not that they are not, it's not that they're unimportant. It's just that we want, from a safety point of view, we really want to pay attention to, yes, what they're saying, how they're saying it, and what they're doing. But it also applies to us. And if we are having a bad day, if we are grumpy one day, we are likely to send a really negative message to people without maybe even realizing it. And when we're talking about risk reduction here and we don't want to be the catalyst ourselves for any particular problem. So we want to always make sure that we are showing up professionally, confidently looking, competently looking. And also when we're looking at other people, we want to be paying attention. Now, on their own, this list of a small list of potentially hostile nonverbal communications, this body language, on their own, they mean absolutely nothing. I mean, I can stand here with, in North Vancouver with my arms crossed. Does it mean I'm a potential threat to you? No. Do any of these individually mean that there's a particular problem? No. But when they are grouped, when a number of them show up, they should start to be sort of red flags to you. And so we want to make sure that we are paying attention so that we see these red flags, because the person could be standing right in front of you and you not even see the problem because you're focused on something else. When we deal with a lot of organizations that have a sort of a customer service lens to their workplaces, often there's so much focus on customer service that it muddies the staff's ability to see any risky behaviors. We were at a workshop the other day, and there was a lady in our session that has I suppose just before COVID, she'd just finished 5 years working on the Disney cruise ships as a dance instructor, and now she's working as a frontline staff member for this organization. And she was brought up on a diet of full-on customer service. She didn't even realize that she could hang up on an abusive person on the telephone, because that's not what she ever thought customer service was all about. And to some degree, it's not. But we have a limit, and we want to. Not we, but the organization doesn't want you to put up with aggressive and confrontational people, even on the telephone. So it was sometimes we just need to have these conversations with our staff about what is our consistent approach to dealing with people that are showing up and being hostile and aggressive and confrontational and acting out towards us. So when we're trying to gain our situational awareness of another person, look at all this stuff. There's tons that we are on this list here. Clenching of the jaw, that 1,000-yard stare where they're sort of looking right by you and through you, pacing up and down, clenching of the fist, All of these are on their own actually meaningless. But when you've got them in groups, but again, you're only going to see this if you're actually looking for them. And when we're not paying attention, we don't see, that whole adage about you don't see the wood for the trees is very, very true. So here's a bunch of photographs for you, and they're going to be on your screen for a flash of a second. And but you won't necessarily see, unless you're looking for the risk, you won't see the risk even though the person is right in front of you. Today we are in a workplace violence prevention workshop. I've spent the better part of 75 minutes here talking about human beings and the risk they pose. So we are wired today to look for risks, right? We wouldn't be here and signed up on this webinar if we weren't interested in this conversation about human risk. So today we're thinking about it all the time. We see it straight away, but on a day-to-day basis, back in your various workplaces, maybe the staff don't because they've got other things on their mind and they are not necessarily focused on their personal safety all day long because they've got other stuff that's going on. There's a chap that retired a number of years ago from the US Marine Corps and his name was Jeff Cooper. And he came out with this idea, this concept called, it's called Cooper's Color Code of Awareness. And you can look this up, and we've got information that we can share about that as well. But essentially, it talks about your state of mind, and it talks about this white, yellow, orange, red, and black states of mind. And so it's about what we're focused on at any particular time. So I'm going to go back in time here and just talk about these briefly. Jeff talks about the white state of mind, which he sort of calls the daydreaming mode. And all of us daydream. All of us are not focused all the time on personal safety, guaranteed. And he says that, and it's okay, it's a human state. Despite if you think about this, despite the best cup of coffee you've got coursing through your veins, you and I cannot talk any faster than about 160 or 180 words a minute. If we are professionally trained auctioneers, so we're selling, horses at Williams Lake or fancy cars at Barrett Jackson in Vegas, we can get our speech rate up to about 220, 230 words a minute. But you and I, as a brush that I'm using, 160 to 180 words, and that's probably when you got it written down on a piece of paper in front of you. But the brain computes words almost 3 times faster than that. So what that means is that even as I'm talking now at a much slower cadence than 160 words a minute, all of us, including me, have got a conversation that's going around in our heads that's sort of overtaking and superseding the conversation that I'm having with you here in the webinar. So sometimes we have this ability to drift in our minds. Have you ever had a conversation with someone and you've been talking to them and you pause and they ask you a question that actually you've just spoken to them about in the conversation, and you've said you thought you haven't been paying attention to what I've been saying, have you? And it's because we have been thinking about other things, or maybe we're waiting for the other. But one thing we can all be better at is listening skills, for sure. But in terms of daydreaming, it's okay, but just be somewhere safe when you're doing that, please. Have you ever driven your car somewhere and you've actually got to your intended destination? You've sat in your driver's seat, you've turned your engine off, and then you suddenly thought to yourself, how did I get here? That's the white zone. That's that daydreaming mode. So the 2 places that Jeff says do not be in this daydreaming mode is driving your car and dealing with humans at work. There we want to be in this yellow or defensive driving mode. And that's the sort of focus of our comment about the defensive driving school. Have you taken a defensive driving course? Have you gone out for a drive with the instructor? And has the instructor asked you to narrate, verbalize out loud so that they can hear you what sort of risks you're looking for? Because if you know that if you're looking for these risks, and let me go back to this, and the list that I showed you before, when you're looking for risks and they are there, you will see them and you can become prepared. Then you go to this orange state of mind. If you're looking for traffic flow and how far cars are, you're not looking at the car in front. That's too late. That's much too late. You're looking at the car 6, 7 in front of you. When you see their brake lights come on, then your foot comes off the gas, you hover over the brake, and eventually you hit the brake pedal and you slow down. This is this orange or alert stage. And when we're alert, when we're ready for something to happen, a lot of the time it actually doesn't, because we're ready for it. when things tend to happen is when we're not really paying attention. We're back here, and then we go to this, we skip this step because we were never there. We don't even have a chance of becoming alert, and we go straight to this, fight or flight, or even this blind panic mode here. So when we're looking at dealing with people at work, just remind people, please, to be constantly alert, not to be sort of paranoid, but to be alert and look for the things that can elevate the risk. Because if you're looking for them, you will absolutely see them. In one of our workshops, we use the analogy of a red Ford Mustang. So I say to people, okay, on your way here today or yesterday when you're driving around, how many of you saw a red Ford Mustang out on the road? And a lot of people will think about that for a second and say, you know what? I didn't see a red Ford Mustang yesterday. And a lot of the time, people will say that not because there wasn't a red Ford Mustang, but because they weren't actually looking for a red Ford Mustang. Probably someone in that room or on the call had a red Ford Mustang sitting right in front of them at a set of traffic lights and never even paid a blind bit of attention because they weren't looking for that. When you elevate the conversation about safety and talk about risk, a lot of people don't necessarily see the potential risk that's right in front of them until we start talking about it. And then now you've raised their awareness, they become much more alive to it. So if it is there, then they'll pick up on it straight away. So it just gives us an opportunity of this whole state of mind thing, which I think is really important, conversation. Now, bearing in mind the audience that we have here on the webinar, I'm going to use a broad brush here with human beings in general. The vast majority of humans in society, when we are paying attention and when we're looking with our defensive driving mode, and we're looking at them. I've got a great book on the shelf here called People Watching by a British psychologist called Desmond Morris, who wrote a book called The Naked Ape and Man Watching. And it's all about the human form and the messages we send sort of non-verbally. And I think people watching will be an Olympic sport one year, and I'm going to be really good at it. I think a medal contention, I think. But when we look at a good portion of the percentage of the population, a lot of people are this yes, cooperative, compliant, non-confrontational, go where they're supposed to, never present any physical resistance types people. And they also, this percentage, this group of individuals, this yes category, also respond very well to the presence of a person in a position of authority, you and your staff. All of your teams represent a person in a position of authority because you, in whatever service area you happen to be on this call today, you have the right to refuse service to someone. It is a privilege to receive service, not a right. And one of the things is that if we don't behave safely to the team that's providing the service, we should be able to withdraw that service. I mean, obviously we don't want to because you're in the business of providing a really valuable service to, marginalized, vulnerable populations and people that are certainly disadvantaged in society often. So you don't want to do that, which is actually part of the problem because we're reluctant to sort of have this sort of set of this line, if you like, that we draw for people. But know that you, as this person in a position of authority, have massive impact, generally speaking, as long as this is the case. And what I'm talking about here is that you show up professionally, competently, confidently looking, and knowledgeable, caring. I care. I'm here to solve your problem. A lot of messages can be instantly transmitted by how you show up. Right? It takes a blink of an eye for us to make a judgment call, an assumption about someone we're just meeting for the first time, without even talking to them. So all of that is transmitted through what you look like and how you show up and how you behave. And they talk about it takes 7 minutes or 7 seconds to get that first impression. The brain science now tells us it was much faster than 7 seconds. And it's all through how you show up. So one of the things we need to emphasize with our teams is that all of them are walking, talking brand ambassadors for your organization. Every time you and any of your staff members show up, they represent not just them, but everyone in the organization. When I see a staff member of a company, I don't only see that person, I immediately paint the entire organization with the same brush of my experience with that frontline staff member. That's why when we talk about every one of us is responsible for workplace violence, how we show up and project ourselves with people is really is a message about how the organization shows up. And sometimes unless we are reminding our teams of that all the time, we can end up sending a poorer message than we're looking for, because people are having people are maybe showing up and are not as professional, not as safety oriented one day as they perhaps could be. So this is the vast majority, in my mind, many people that we are dealing with still. Now, the people that, if we look at the, pardon me, if we look at the percentages that are left here, these are the individuals that may not be aggressive with you, but they have the ability of wearing down your tolerance level. Like every one of us on this call here today has a veneer of tolerance for people. Sometimes on any given day, I think I have the patience of Job, but some days, you know what, I don't have that much patience. And are we, we're not like fictional figures out of George Orwell's 1984, where we're all the same every single day. We are emotional creatures, and we have buttons that get pushed, and the people that are trying to push those buttons, maybe deliberately or just unintentionally, sometimes can create for us an elevated level of angst. One of the one of the sessions that we did just last week was, there's a staff member where she in this public facing organization, there's a person that comes in on a regular basis, and she shared in the class with us that this guy just pushes her buttons all the time. She almost has this panic situation when she sees him coming in, but she's never shared it with the manager. Fortunately, the manager was in the room with us, so we had a really healthy conversation about how we can support this staff member and how we can maybe deal with the situation that we've not previously been aware of, because he never did anything violent or aggressive. She never felt that she had the option of actually documenting or talking to someone about it. She just dealt with it. But her staff member sitting next to her said, you really don't get on with that person, do you? And he doesn't get on with you. So other people knew there was this tension in the relationship. And so it's about elevating the level of awareness of how we deal with individuals, maybe specific individuals sometimes, and how we can support staff in being better resilient for those individuals. But I can tell you, this is for our BC Ferries sessions. This is the passenger that comes up to a BC Ferry employee and says, "What time does the 1 o'clock ferry go today?" It's one of those sort of a questions that designed perhaps, or the intention or the impact of it gets under someone's sort of skin a little bit. And we all have these emotional buttons that people sometimes press, and on some days we are brilliant. Other days we've got sort of emotional, we've got less emotional armor, because when we are, presumably, I'm going to make this as this is a fairly rash statement, I'm going to say, but people that work in your organization, in this unique sort of environment, they probably love human beings. They are there to provide a service. They're there to help their fellow beings. And so in that desire, in that sense of purpose, that's why I signed up to work here, to do something really important for me, for other people. In that sense of having this massive, awesome human purpose, it can sometimes get in the way of us seeing a situation from a safety point of view, because we feel that that's our role, is to provide this service no matter what sometimes. And so one of the things that's just to do is to really sort of support people through understanding that they have a right to have a safe workplace. There's a responsibility for us to provide them with a safe workplace. And the workplace violence, the definition, is not one of those situations where there has to be the intent behind the behavior to harm. So the question here is, I'll just deal with this right now. Do you have any particular suggestions or tips, particularly with people who get aggressive when asked to wear masks, when accessing services, or even show proof of vaccination? A really great question. Thank you. So this is about, this isn't your rule. This is, we are in this provincial state at the moment where there's a provincial health order. And although you happen to be on the pointy end of delivering that message, it's not something you've randomly thought up over the coffee table. It's actually the pointy end of a law that everyone wear masks. So this is where the access to service, unless they've got a bona fide reason why they are not wearing a mask, it's just I don't want to. And we've had silent protests throughout the communities recently. The I think so. Signage is really important. Having a consistent message with everyone, with the staff, is really important. Having supervisor managerial support is really important, and I think having that consistency is huge. And allowing the for us to set the ground rules straight away with signage, with posters, with even with having this message that is delivered all the time. I mean, already, and we've had this in place since Monday, I've been into a couple of organizations where, they haven't necessarily been consistent with asking. And I'm sort of standing there saying, don't you want to see the vaccination card? Oh, yeah, that's right. So all of a sudden, we're getting used to a new set of regulations. And the staff need to be well informed about the fact that, okay, it's not your rule, it's a provincial health order. And what is our consistent message? And sometimes providing a script often for people to make sure it's consistent, so there's no sort of gaps in that is really is really important. And I think that one of the things we can do is to make sure that their expectations are managed before they even get to us, so there's no surprises. One of the things that I think it's really important that the staff have information and provide education in an informative and non-confrontational way, of course, and also realize that can become very tiring very quickly. I'm going to share with you. I'll share with you now. I mean, if you're dealing with the first person that you're talking to on day one, you probably have lots of patience, but if you're dealing with 100 people that particular day, you're telling them exactly the same thing, including people that are standing in line, and you think, didn't you hear what I supposed to say to the person in front? Then they want their own personal sort of information to give into them because they think, oh, maybe it doesn't apply to me. I'll push someone's buttons. We've got to be consistent, and so it's about understanding that the staff are going to be supported when they draw that line. And I'm going in our verbal judo, one of those moments, if how we show up in a professional sense, if how we provide information to people, if that's not good enough, then we need to involve the next line of supervisory staff, because often I think that people listen to someone that's introduced to them as a supervisor or a manager or someone in charge differently than they listen to maybe a frontline staff member. But I think it's really important that we have a script that we share or that we come up with that people feel comfortable with, because even in the even in our sort of way of some of us aren't necessarily used to talking about consequences with people that we want to provide a service to, because it just doesn't feel in our nature. It's not how we're wired. It's like the person that worked for Disney who never felt she had an opportunity or couldn't hang up on someone even if they were being abusive on the phone. So I hope that helps. So what we want to collectively come up with, what are we going to say to people? Let's get the message right, and let's not go off script. Let's be consistent, because there's nothing worse, I think, and you probably have this experience as an individual, when you're in contact with a company or an organization and you have you ask one question, but you're asking 3 different people at 3 different times and get 3 different responses about what the organization's policy is. That's awfully confusing, and it's awfully, doesn't help us sort of remain peaceful. The question here is, can you give me an example of the maybe individual as a co-worker in the workplace? But this would be a person that that is argumentative, that doesn't want to help out, that is doesn't. There's some great work, and do I have one here with me? There's an organization. You may have heard of the Gallup poll organization. A number of years ago, 1999, they did a fantastically huge survey to try and find out what the questions were that defined a culture of an organization. And they came out with these 12 questions. They're brilliant. The first question is that you ask yourself, and you can ask other people this question: do I know what's expected of me in my job? And it's interesting because a lot of people are naturally say, yeah, oh yeah, I know what's expected of me in my job. But actually maybe the organization's expectations of your job is different from what you think your job is. And one of the things here is if I am not held accountable for my confrontational, may not be aggressive, but it could just be a lack of support. The person's never around at busy times. They don't get they're always looking for, I'm just thinking of, these are random things I'm thinking here, but it's a person that is not there to support people and leaves us on our own sometimes, where we are isolated in a front-facing organization. It could also be the person that uses sarcasm with people. Maybe there's a hierarchy in the organization. There's based on seniority or something, and someone uses a seniority level in an organization to put down junior members, people that are have less seniority, where there's not a level playing field. It feels so people feel unsupported, where people feel maybe even unwelcome, not included in things. So it's that sort of opportunity there. Is a maybe person less likely to be a team player and would more like excel in a more individual position when they move on? Very interesting, because there's a great book on my shelf here called Go Put Your Strengths to Work. And if we find out how we're wired, if we work out what we are supposed to be doing in our world, sometimes we find ourselves in a position where we think we like people, but actually we shouldn't be working with human beings. We had a person the other day in a class that said, she signed up for this front-facing position, but when she got there, she really found she realized she was so introverted that really that wasn't where she should be. She needed to be in an administrative role where there's not people around. And she realized that after a situation that took her a while to find out what the root cause was. So yeah, I think that sometimes that could be definitely a major lesson. Thank you so much, by the way. The last group of individuals, fortunately, and maybe the percentages are off in our sort of in the audience group we have here today, but it's going to be the smallest group of any of them, regardless of what industry you happen to be in, is going to be this group where they are confrontational, where they are intimidating, where they could become aggressive, where they are maybe even assaultive, which is why we are going to now sort of go into this sort of the organizational philosophy of having a zero tolerance policy, because if you allow a situation for someone to behave in a way where they should be held accountable for that, and you don't hold them accountable for that, the chances of the behavior escalating in the future, or even there being there can be often no limit on the amount of aggression that someone displays and is allowed to get away with in their mind if there's no accountability. So really, whatever the consequences look like in your world, we shouldn't. And when we look at this, I come back to this sort of foundational document based on the WorkSafe legislation that we have here in this province, which we've had for 20 plus years. We have a legal requirement to provide a safe workplace. I, as an individual employee, can't be my best version of myself if I work in a workplace where I'm constantly thinking about, am I safe here all the time? I don't see the support. I don't feel the support here. So, and when people behave in a way where there's no accountability, there's no consequences, when there's no response, it can send a message to staff that, well, when is there going to be a response? Like at what level is there going to be safety imposed here or implied? So one of the things that we want to sort of focus here is just knowing that they're the rarest ones for sure. But when, Sat was sharing the statistics earlier on, and what have we got here? So, 24.5% of all claims are violence and acts of violence and force claims here. So, I mean, it may be the smallest, but it's still happening an awful lot. And we still need to be, elevating the education, the awareness, the preventative methods, and perhaps, as I mentioned before, despite the fact you've got policies in place, and I'm sure every single organization where those claims came from has policies where the risk assessments have occurred, where we've done training before, and still they happen. So there's no guarantee. But the more that we do talk about it, the more emphasis that we place on it, the better we will become. And I believe, the number one thing that we need to sort of share as a collective in our organizations is here's an opportunity for everyone to participate in coming up with ideas and suggestions about how we can all be safer. And the in this last group, one of the ones we had last week, the manager was sitting there scribing notes, and she's been heavily involved in this before, but all of a sudden we have this opportunity to do some brainstorming in a session for this one group of 20 staff, and she's got pages and pages of to-do items which she's going to distribute to everyone, because the more that we can involve other people in the problem solving, the more ownership people feel of it, and the more likely they are to be vested in a safe workplace. If it's just one person's job, all of a sudden we can feel someone else's we can what is the word I'm looking for, we can feel as though it's been delegated to someone else, someone else's responsibility. We can sort of feel uninvolved very quickly. Good question. How does someone become a 3%? Is it because of the environment or personal life stress? Well, if we can answer that question with any degree of certainty, then we'll be writing a number of books and have our own TV show. There can be lots of stuff going on. It might not even be intentional behavior that the person is aware of. So from a personal point of view, there's a lot of it comes down to a lack of accountability for behavior in the past, but it could also be just a life stressor moment as well. So there's lots of, I think that the if we have been brought up on a diet of aggression and getting our own way by being forceful, I grew up in an environment in the south of England. I was a victim of a high school bully for 4 years. I absolutely, it's a strong word, but I'll use it here. I hated high school. I was not a good student because of this one kid, and whom I have forgiven, because I fully believe that this kid was a victim of abuse at home, and he used school and as an outlet for that frustration and that anger. So it could a 3% person, and he was definitely this. Where does it come from? I wish I knew, but I think that empathy, which we're going to talk about, is a massive part of how we're going to get through this. And if we can demonstrate empathy to people regularly, I think it's going to be great. Okay, just trying to think of the timing here. We're all good. Why a zero tolerance policy? Now, the philosophy behind this is to have consistency, to not have one situation where there's no response and another situation where there's tons of response, and there to be this inconsistent approach. Because when people are treated inconsistently, when they sense maybe or experience that they are not held accountable for their behavior, and there's no response, there's no response to that, it can, in some cases, again, not everyone, but it can get worse and worse. Imagine the game of soccer. If the referee did not carry a red card, if there was no red card in the game of soccer, what would the game of soccer be like? Like if the only thing that a referee could do is warn a player to behave themselves with the yellow card, but there's no actual consequences. So the idea behind the zero tolerance philosophy has its roots in the origin story, if you like, in this philosophy called the escalating circle of violence, where let me go back, sorry, I probably it's too fast, where in one situation, if you allow someone, not through any malintent, but just didn't know how to deal with it, or maybe thought it was a one-off situation, if I do something with a staff member towards a staff member and I'm not held accountable for it, often there's this feeling in this subconsciously that, okay, well, I'm going to elevate it the next time. And again, it will get worse and worse. I'll tell you a story. I'm doing a training session in the city council chambers one time. It's a few years ago with a client, and it's a municipal swimming pool. And I don't know why I'm pointing over here, but anyway, it's and in this training session there were 26 aquatic leaders, so lifeguards, all of them. They had shut down the pool for the night. They were all there, and one of the aquatic staff members, one of the lifeguards, said to me, "Phil, if someone spits in my face, is that an assault? And I said, well, on the face of just that, yes, but tell me more about it. And so he then told a story to not only me, but the rest of his group, that had happened just the night before. And he didn't do anything about it, primarily because he knew he was coming to the session the next night and he wanted to ask me about it, or maybe he thought that we would cover it, which we will in a second, but we haven't up until this point. But now is the point when he asked me, ironically enough. He put his hand up and said, Phil. And interestingly enough, so what the situation was, and that led to him being spat in the face, which is an assault under the circumstances of how it happened, was that there was a dad and a 5-year-old kid that came into the pool. Dad hops into the hot tub and basically is there enjoying this time there. The 5-year-old kid jumps into the pool and starts doing laps. Now we have a law in this land that says if you are 6 and under, you must have an adult, caregiver, chaperone, parent, whatever it is, in the pool with you within arm's reach. And the dad didn't want to be in there, and the kid is 5 years old. The lifeguard says, "How old is your kid?" He says 5. Well, I'm sorry, sir, you got to get out of the hot tub and be in the pool with him. And this kid was like Dash in The Incredibles, she was swimming like super fast across the pool. Excellent swimmer, which is why the dad said, "No thanks, that doesn't apply to me. Look at my kid, brilliant swimmer." And eventually an argument ensued. The dad gets out of the hot tub, has a really confrontational situation with the lifeguard, and eventually spits in his face. Did the lifeguard eventually get the dad out of the hot tub into the pool? No. In fact, the lifeguard got into the pool to look after the kid himself. There are 2 supervisors in this room who are horrified at this story. Plus, there are 5 other lifeguards in this room who had had the same sort of run-in with the same person. No one had ever been spat at before, but these 5 people gave similar stories about how they couldn't get this guy out of the hot tub into the pool. So he'd never actually been held accountable for his illegal behavior. So one of the things this is, when you think about that story, I fully believe that the lifeguard got spat on because we didn't deal with that first time. And a lot of the lack of response was due to the fact that they didn't know who he was, never seen him before, never saw him again, never had any interaction. It was a one-off situation. They thought it was just someone having a bad day, and they sort of used that as an excuse to, I'll take care of it, regardless of the fact that there is a piece of legislation in British Columbia saying 6 and under, you're in the pool. So, and the reason, I don't know, and I don't ever, people knew in the room, but I don't know, telling you here, whether the lifeguard ever explained to the guy why he needed to, what the rule was. So when we're talking about masks and stuff like this, how do we explain? Do we just say it's a policy? Turn the TV on at 1 o'clock, watch Bonnie Henry, it's a law. Or do we actually provide information? Because the lifeguard could have said, hey, it's a safety policy. But if I'm the lifeguard and I'd said to the dad, you know what, we have throughout British Columbia, and I'm sure across Canada, there's been so many inquests into fatalities, into drownings in pools. And they have determined that up until the age of 6, a kid does not have the mental capacity to know when they're about to get tired. They don't know when that moment of exhaustion is going to occur. And what they have found is that your kid, absolutely, he appears to be a strong swimmer, but we don't know that when he's swimming and he's halfway across the pool, all of a sudden he runs out of steam, stops leg movements and drowns because he doesn't know the difference when that moment of tiredness is going to appear. That's why up until the age of 6, we need to be in the pool. Dad may not like it, but if you explain that in a way that makes sense to people, a lot of times you will get compliance. And it can be exhausting explaining that to people because you may be explaining it many, many times. But what we tend to do is become short with the stories, and it becomes, it's a policy issue, it's a safety issue. And when we explain it like that, it comes across to the other person as, do it because I'm telling you to. That's where your position as a person in a position of authority actually works against you, because no one likes being told to do something because of my position in life. I will do it. I'll be compliant if you teach me, or not teach me, but if you share the logic behind the story or behind what you want me to do. So and don't let me stay in the hot tub. I mean, there's got to be consequences for if he refuses to get out, even with the best stories. Then let's do this. Stop work. Let's get everyone out the pool. Let's send a message. Let's say I'm sorry. Then we can't go on because it's not a safe workplace anymore. And that's then maybe the message will get through. Who knows? So that's why the zero tolerance policy, and also the other thing about zero tolerance policy is it will mandate reporting. It mandates reporting, so you will find out what is going on. When we first started, I just know that most organizations underreport incidents, and when we underreport incidents, that creates a lack of knowledge, a lack of awareness of what the risks are in the workplace. Okay. Here's a question I sent. I'm not sure if you can receive it as someone who is available as a woman who faces so one of the things is what we're talking about here is how do we come up with a plan for treating everyone respectfully based on even the human rights legislation here, because this is part of it as well, right? We're talking about all sorts of things might have their it might be, here's a philosophy for you. I'll try and answer this question before I show you this. One of my kids works for Starbucks, and you may remember that a few years ago they had a terrible situation in Philadelphia where the number one value of the organization, which is everyone's welcome, was violated by a manager who had two people of color sitting in the Starbucks and had them arrested for trespassing when they refused to buy anything. The number one value of the Starbucks organization has been, forever since it got created in Seattle, has been you can come into any store and hang around. I mean, it's different now with our COVID regulations, but when we get through that, we'll be back again, and you don't have to buy anything. So one of the things that happened is that after that sort of blew up, the owner of Starbucks flies out to Philadelphia, buys national airtime, and apologizes and says, this is my fault that happened in Philadelphia because we haven't talked about our values as an organization enough. We haven't talked about respect. We haven't talked about unconscious bias. We haven't talked about how we treat not only people in our store, but also each other. So one of the consequences for that was that they shut down Starbucks for 4 hours, first in the States and then in Canada. You may remember this, where they taught their staff, where they reminded them about how we deal with people from a respectful place, from an unconscious bias place. So again, reminding people of those ground rules of treating people. And then, because a lot of times in organizations, we need to be reminded of what the ground rules are. Sat said it earlier on about one of the things where it's a massive, we forget, we don't talk about it enough. And that's why perhaps the owner of Starbucks thought that one of his managers, who's a leader in the organization in that particular store, forgot the number one value that the organization has been based on. So often it's about reminding people of what our values are. And values, although they are sometimes written down, they don't need to be written down because they should show up in behaviors that people demonstrate in the workplace. If I walk into your organization, I shouldn't need to know what it says on the branding document as to the values of your organization. I should see the values of your organization demonstrated by how people treat me and treat each other. So it's often about maintaining that conversation and reminding people about that. So hopefully, because some of these issues will have there'll be an unconscious bias root in connected with human rights issues for sure. So we want to be inclusive. We want to not ostracize anyone in the workplace, and we want to send a message that we're going to protect everyone here and hold people accountable when people either forget or deliberately stray outside those boundaries. How do we encourage staff to report incidents even if it's a minor issue? That's a great question. If one of the things I would suggest, and sort of just go there here, but I've got the floor, so I'm going to go there. In the world of occupational health and safety, profession of occupational health and safety, there is a philosophy that I absolutely love, and it's called Heinrich's risk accident pyramid. And it's basically so this chap Dr. Heinrich in 1929, I think, came out with this. And you can look, if you look it up onto a search engine, you'll see a graphic, which basically it's a triangle and it has 5 levels. At the bottom level, it has hazards and risks. On the next level, it has near misses. On the next level, it has minor injuries, major injuries. And the top part of the pyramid is fatalities. And the idea behind supporting people reporting even minor issues is that what you're doing, and you will be aware, perhaps from a British Columbia perspective, that for the longest time, we only investigated incidents in the workplace where someone actually got hurt. So we're like halfway up this pyramid and we only investigate minor injuries, major injuries, or fatalities. Remember, I started off by telling you about my colleague in the police department who succumbed to a fatal needle prick injury. And everyone says, oh, it was just a matter of time before that happened, because we knew what the risks were, but we didn't do anything about it until someone either got hurt, seriously hurt, or in Colin's case, dead. Now we investigate near misses, right? We have the legislation to investigate near misses, which is why we want to, when no one gets actually hurt, but they could have done, we want to take care of that. And if we lowered it even more, to look after this is what they did in BC Ferries. They lowered it to give everyone, the idea to identify hazards and we'll get rid of them before they even become near misses. So what near misses are now, people may think, well, it's so minor. The lady who was victimized by having a complete cup of pencils and pens thrown at her just recently never reported it, because even though some of them hit her, she wasn't hurt, and didn't, and thought it was a person just having a bad day, which it was perhaps. But if I can go into City Hall and do that to staff members, then that sets that wheel in motion as far as I'm concerned. And who knows what the next person might be suffering from me as a result of my behavior. So we want to report those minor ones, because part of that reporting is an investigation to say, how can we prevent, is there a way we can mitigate this for the next time? And so if we start to chip away at the bottom of the pyramid, we reduce the size of the pyramid because we're reducing the size of that near miss level. That's the sort of philosophy behind why we're reporting and why we're documenting and reporting and investigating near misses. So that hopefully answers the question. It's more of a, if I had a graphic here, it would be awesome to show you that, but that's essentially the philosophy behind it. That let's not wait until if we tackle the stuff at the bottom level. In crime prevention, there's a thing called the broken windows theory. And the idea behind the broken windows theory is that if you see a broken window or a bit of graffiti or a light that's been smashed out, if you leave it alone, if you don't do anything about it, often people will come by and go, well, no one cares about this. So more windows get smashed out, more graffiti arrives, more light bulbs go, and it becomes a bit of a mess. But if you paint over every bit of graffiti, if you fix every window, if you fix every light bulb, replace every light bulb, it sends a message that people care about this, and it becomes a safer sort of place to hang around, a better community. That's exactly what we're doing with reporting those minor issues. They're not minor, because if you allow them to go unaddressed, they'll become part of something bigger. I hope that helps. Okay. Let's go and talk about the criminal code for a second. So this is what the law says, and I've got two. I was watching the news, as we do, and I think didn't the Prime Minister have someone that threatened to do damage to him the other day? So this is the section under the criminal code that would apply here. You need to know that the age of criminal responsibility in Canada is 12. So when someone hits 12, we are supposed to know the difference between good and bad, right and wrong. That's why they do anti-bullying programs in grade 7, because that's where some kids hit the age of 12. And this is, so between 12 and 15, the Youth and Criminal Justice Act sort of applies. At 15, we can be raised to adult court, and adulthood federally is 18, 19 provincially. So this is the definition of a threat. Everyone commits an offense who in any manner, so I can threaten you if I verbally threaten you, which I think happened to the Prime Minister, I could send you a text, I could send you an email, I could leave you a voicemail message, I could leave a note under your windshield, I could send a message through other people. It doesn't matter how you receive the threat. Knowingly utters, conveys, or causes any person to receive a threat, but the language in the threat has to be about causing someone's death or bodily harm. It can't be, I'm going to have your job. or you and I are going to take a walk outside, get some fresh air. That's not a threat to, you might interpret it as, but the language in the threat isn't specific enough for that to be here. This is it has a maximum sentence of 2 years in custody, so it's viewed as a sort of entry in terms of the consequences on the lower end of the scale, because it's very easy to commit, and you don't need a couple of things in order to convict someone of this. You don't need to believe the threat to be real, like you don't need to be frightened by the threat, and you certainly don't need to put the person you don't need to prove the person meant the threat to be taken seriously. So this definition really of criminal threat is about the transmission of the message more than actually fear being result of it. So that's why it happens a lot without necessarily people realizing it's happening. So, and in a workplace such as yours, I feel that and there's over 800 offenses. We could talk about intimidation, criminal harassment, but I chose the threatening, and I chose this to share with you. There are two ways I can assault you. I can assault you by touching you, which is the first way, which is like 1A. So a person commits an assault when without the consent of another person. So if you think about two players dropping their gloves on a hockey match and going at it, that is a consensual act. If I am Todd Bertuzzi and I'm chasing Steve Moore and I hit him from behind, that's a non-consensual act. So that's why it sort of was an assault. He applies force intentionally to the other person, directly or indirectly. So if I spit at you, as in that pool example, it's indirect. If I throw pencils at you in the city hall, it's indirect. If I touch you, it's direct. If I strike you with my car deliberately, it's not a motor vehicle accident. It's an assault with a weapon. Staff member at BC Ferries having a hot cup of coffee thrown over her the other day. Assault with a weapon causing bodily harm. So that's the first part of an assault, and it doesn't require pain or anything like that. It's just touching you without your permission, basically. The other part of how an assault can occur, which is where the legislation gets its broad strokes from, is the second part. A person commits an assault when, so the first part deals with my attempt and I'm a really bad throw, which I am, but it deals with the other part. A person commits an assault when I threaten by an act or a gesture to apply force to another person if I have or cause the other person to believe upon reasonable grounds that I have what's called present ability to effect my purpose. What this means is if I can just pull up the legislation here. That's I was going to look for my glasses then, but then I realized I'm actually wearing them. One of the legislation, what I had it highlighted, brilliant, in the in WorkSafe language is being prepared. I will find it in a second. Stand by. What present ability to effect my purpose means is that if I have the immediate means of carrying out what you think is about to happen to you, even though it never actually does. So if I'm in your personal space, if I'm in your environment, if I'm half a mile away and I can't I don't have the immediate means of carrying out what you think could happen to you. So I have to be physically in your environment. So the regulation defines violence as the attempted or actual exercise by a person other than a worker of any physical force so as to cause injury to a worker, and includes any threatening statement or behavior which gives a worker reasonable grounds to believe that he or she is at risk of injury. That's where the legislation from WorkSafe BC came from, the criminal definition of assault here. So, and actually, what is really important to bear in mind here, the name of the pyramid, by the way, is Heinrich's Risk Accident Pyramid from 1929. HEINRICH apostrophe. In the first definition, if I touch you, you have to prove that I meant to touch you. The word intent is in the first definition. If I don't touch you, but I just scare you, which is what we're talking about here, includes any threatening statement or behavior which gives the worker reasonable cause to believe that he or she is at risk of injury. If I just scare you, you don't have to prove that I meant that to happen. right? You don't have to prove my intent behind my behavior. What this is about the impact on you, not the intent behind the word intent does not appear in the second definition here. So it's really this in my mind is where a lot of people are um, are at risk in workplaces and perhaps don't even know they're maybe have been assaulted because they didn't necessarily understand what the legislation talks about. Can you repeat that about the laws with youth, which are yes, okay. So just the ages there from a question here. Age of criminal responsibility in Canada is 12. It's 10 in Britain. It was a terrible situation in Liverpool a number of years ago involving two 10-year-olds. So at 12, that's when, so under that age, we're not given the opportunity, we're not said, I think we could be flexible on this, but at the moment the law says 12. So it doesn't matter what type of offense a person commits between 12 and 15, even if they take someone's life, they will not be sentenced to any more than 7 years in custody within the youth custody system underneath, and it's part of what's called the Youth and Criminal Justice Act. That's the piece of legislation that mandates the consequences, I suppose, for between 12 and 15-year-olds. After 15, after our 15th birthday, for a serious persons offense, which means offense against another human being, we could be raised to what we call adult court. So that can happen between 15 and 18. After 18, we are subject to federal legislation. You're welcome. All good. Like I say, this is a great conversation. And I've got tons of stuff here. I want to talk about canaries. I want to talk about FBI and how people see stuff. So I've got a big timer here set. So I think I've got about 40 minutes before we cut off. There's something called the ladder of aggression, which may apply in some situations. And the ladder of aggression is basically this warning sign that sometimes is given off by people. Now, people that are unpredictable, that may be suffering from mental illness or maybe have they've got alcohol or drugs on board that eliminates sort of a rational decision-making process, or a ladder, if you like. We're going to talk about them briefly in a bit. But these, for other people, often there are warning signs. Like it's like a traffic light system. Maybe I should have color coded it that way. Where if you're talking to a person that you have a legitimate reason to be talking to, a person that you're providing a service to, and they deliberately, well, not deliberately, but they conspicuously ignore you, like turn the other way and don't want to talk to you, and you have a legitimate reason to be having that conversation, that's not a good sign that they're in a good place. Or you, if anything was to happen, and if you need to talk to them further. So it's not normally in our nature to deliberately ignore a person. And so we want to just not, we want to say, okay, well, maybe now, do I have to have that conversation now with this person, or maybe I'll wait till later on? But also we want to be thinking, is it a warning sign? Should we be paying attention? Is it a red Ford Mustang, right? Is it a broken window? These are the things that I want, these analogies that I suppose mean a lot to me, but I want them to, I want to be thinking about the conversation about risk. Is that a sign of risk? And ignoring it and saying, that's how he is always on a Friday sort of thing. That's one way of dismissing the risk. And when we dismiss risk, we open ourselves up, I think. The next stage, maybe the next step on this ladder, is where someone would jump onto it, is maybe what we just call displaying excessive emotional attention, where the person's, this would be that maybe exaggerated movement may be combined with this, with that acting out behavior, where the person is yelling and screaming and they're causing a big fuss and they get other people's attention. And, are they just venting? Are they wanting other people to join in? Do they want it to be a group activity? And so there's that dynamic where you might have other people that sort of join into the behavior that elevates the risk. For someone that steps into your personal space, I mean, we're talking about keeping 6 feet, but if they step into that 3-foot bubble, where they are really close to us. A lot of us don't like it when people step close to us and that we don't invite or don't know. And a lot of times it may be someone that's trying to intimidate us. Maybe they're not prone to being violent, but they're just trying to press our emotional buttons. And then there's that moment where, and so that may be, so it's not everyone that goes all 5 steps. You know, someone may just go to 1 and that'll be it. They're just having a bad day and don't want to talk to you. Second one, they may just be venting and then they clear off and do something else. The third one, there's that intimidation tactic, and then our, you know, the technique we're going to share with you does not say step into their personal space. Don't make this, you know, 1.5 foot. It's about, but don't run away either. It's about creating distance between you and them, for sure, appropriately. But then there's this moment where, this last one, where all of a sudden you might notice this dynamic where the person has been verbally aggressive and even acting out in a way, and then all of a sudden they go quiet. And sometimes, again, this is a big brush that we've got to use here, so we've got to be careful about it, it's because there's that mental moment where the person is moving from being verbally abusive, verbally aggressive, to actually thinking about striking you. When I had my nose broken as a police officer on day 1 of my career, about an hour after I met Freddie Mercury, but that's a totally other story. One of the things that I remember now, that I waited. He paused and I paused, and there was this moment where I thought he was going to do a normal thing and put his hands up and be handcuffed, but he wasn't. This is what he did to me, and I stayed in that space where he could easily strike me, and I would never do that. I never did that again. So, but sometimes we think we think we've done our job. We think the person's going to calm down now, and if we think that, we just need to step back. We just give the person the space, give you space from striking distance. And number 5, I mean, this goes back to a question we had earlier on about what is the background behind a number 3 person, a type 3 or 3% person. And it's got, in my mind, it's got a lot to do with how they you know, their experiences, their lived experience, and how they, you know, how they resolve disputes. And sometimes it's about, you know, getting their way and never been held accountable, and that's just, hey, it works, so that's what they use. So and we haven't managed their expectations very well before. Okay, I want to share with you it's important that we do this, and we've got a few things to cover yet. This verbal judo philosophy. So you will have, down at your local library, you will have seen, you could see this book on the shelf. And George Thompson and his partner wrote this book in response to being hired by the Los Angeles Police Department a number of years ago. And it provides a structure in terms of verbal de-escalation for people in certainly service front-facing organizations like yourself. So it consists of this. That's what the final slide will look like. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we're going to get there, but this would be a great slide to take a screenshot of, and in the handout PDF document that is available, or maybe coming to you, it's in there as well. But if we were doing this live, I would give you a little card because it has this as a reminder. The blue dots are about sort of customer service oriented, informal resolution, officer friendly type of approaches. We're trying to resolve it informally, the concern, trying to get compliance from the individual by going in sort of fairly lightweight, hoping to get verbal. I'll share that with you in a second. And then we get to this stage where all of a sudden we run out of options, but we want to have a consequential question to confirm what their continued non-compliance means. And the question we're going to use is that one right on the bottom of the screen there. Is there anything I can do or say to get your cooperation? Followed by, because if there's not, you are leaving me no alternative but to, and it's going to be, you know, that red card, that consequences for holding someone accountable for behavior that doesn't stop. So that's when we're going to, and that's why we need to be consistent and comfortable with being consistent in our organizations. And we want to have a collective voice about, okay, how are we, where's that line? How are we going to draw it? What is the message we're going to send to people? Because the moment that we start being inconsistent with our treatment of different people, one of the things is when moment be, am I muted here, or am I looking at it? Hoping We're okay here. One of the things I want to make sure is that this is a consistent approach here. So let me go back in time here. And okay, thank you. We're going to start off with presence. And bearing in mind, we don't want it to be a 5-step program. We want it to be a 1-step program. If that doesn't work, we want it to be a maximum of 2 steps or a maximum of 3 steps. The others are available to us if we cannot get compliance at any other stage. But we're going to start at the lightweight stage, which is the first one. And this is the presence, meaning your presence. Like, how do you show up to me? If I am a user of your service, if I'm one of your customers, clients, constituents, whatever it is, how do you present yourself to me? And this is why we want everyone in the organization to recognize the power of being that walking, talking billboard for your organization. We want you to be absolutely professional. We want you to look professional. We want you to sound professional. We want you to sound knowledgeable, sound helpful. We want you to sound empathetic. You're here. You want to problem solve, all of that stuff. And this goes back to how quickly I make a judgment about you when I walk into your premises, and it's almost instantly. And you have control over that by how you show up. So let's make sure that our presence is a positive one, and we don't show up in a way that's actually a negative one. And if we are supervising and managing our workplaces and we look around at our team and we see an opportunity to elevate the professionalism, the information look of ourselves, I'm not sure what that means, but elevate the appearance of us, elevate our brand, if you like. A lot of times we can get compliance just because we look as though we know what we're doing. But sometimes we might get non-compliance because we look as though we don't care, we're bored, we're having a bad day, we're stressed, all of those sort of things. So your presence is massively important. If you imagine, cast your mind back to when we're at school, or maybe at college, and you're late for a class, and maybe like a time management class or something that you're late for, and you're racing down the corridor, and all of a sudden the teacher sort of comes out of a door and puts her head and looks down the corridor. All of a sudden you go from running to fast walking. So you've changed your behavior based on the presence of someone in a position of authority that has showed up in your life. Really, really powerful sort of message. So sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't, which is why we have another stage. Now, this is the moment where you are, you've got to introduce yourself. So you may know the person, obviously, but I still think that this is that verbal acknowledgement of their presence that you've noticed, and where you now get to show off your knowledge of why you want the person to either not do something or why you want the person to do something. So this is that story, right? This is the story behind the legislation or the rule or the policy. Don't tell me it's a policy. Don't tell me it's a safety issue. Tell me why. I need to know the why, because I will sound informative. I will sound knowledgeable. I will sound, and even like the story about why I need the dad to get out of the pool and be in the pool with his out of the hot tub and be in the pool with his kid. If you know the background to why, if we're traveling on BC ferries and we're in that lower car deck, the one that's sealed, like the background to why we have to leave that car now and go upstairs comes from a horrific accident way back in the English Channel when 168 people died because they could not get out of a sealed car deck on a ferry that capsized coming out of Belgium on the way over to England. And the International Maritime Organization imposed this piece of legislation saying if you're on the lower car deck in a sealed car deck and there's no holes in the windows and you can't get out of there if there was an emergency, that's why you need to be upstairs. All the ferry companies across Canada had this sort of dispensation from Transport Canada, but a couple of years ago they said, you know what, we need to be compliant. And I don't like that change. People don't like change, but if I understand the change, I'm going to be really compliant. So it's often about making sure that staff have the story and can share the why in an informative way. And if that does not work, then my suggestion to you, distraction techniques. Call your supervisor. Give them the opportunity of calling your supervisor. Refer to someone else, you know, a supervisor or a manager, and always, always, always give that person the heads up as to who you're referring them to. Don't leave your supervisor surprised by the person that's going to come and talk to them, or what the issue is. Always try and give them that forewarned is definitely forearmed, right? And it's interesting because this goes back to that philosophy that we're born with those sort of two sets of ears. We listen differently to someone that's introduced to us as a supervisor. So those are the sort of informal resolution options that are available to us in this sort of journey. Then we need to, if that doesn't work, if we got to this stage, you know, and you might get here really, really quickly, you know, because there may be a situation where the person's really confrontational quite quickly. Let's ask them a question. Is there anything I can do or say to get your cooperation? Because if there's not, you're leaving me no alternative but to whatever the consequences are of the non-compliance that you're going to come up with as an organization. What are the options that you have there? And it may depend on where you are physically located. If you are a remote location, then maybe your options are different from those that are, you know, in the lower mainland here. So we've got to be appropriate for staff safety, but consistent as well. And this really is that, you know, I told you earlier on about the fact that the referee only makes one discipline decision in a soccer game, and it's to show a player the yellow card. The person that makes the actual decision whether they leave the pitch on a red card offense is not the referee. It is the player by continuing to misbehave, basically. And it's exactly this, what we're talking about. You know, if you continue, this is going to be the consequence. And then you're going to act, because that's one last question that you're going to, one last opportunity for the person to be compliant. And again, it's one of those things that can take practice. Often that line there, is there anything I can do or say to get your cooperation, could be one of those scripted things that we think of, that we have in front of us that we can say, and would help people that are struggling for what to say in a certain situation. But I think having consistency with people as well when we're on the telephone, and many of you may deal with aggression or abusive people on the telephone. Let's have a consistent approach. This is how you can professionally hang up on people. The lady from Disney was paying huge attention to this last week. So if you go and get George Thompson's book called Verbal Judo, you'll see quite quickly in the book that he espouses the word empathy. In fact, he says quite clearly in the opening pages, the single most powerful word in the English language is the word empathy. And why it's the single most powerful word is that it's harder to remain hostile at someone that's trying to understand where you're coming from. And I would imagine that the number one value that everyone working in your various organizations, you included, espouse and practice is empathy, because of the environment that you've chosen to work in. So this should come naturally. When we are sympathetic, it means we're agreeing with a person. When we're empathetic, we don't even have to agree with them. All we're doing is giving them some acknowledgement of the angst that they are demonstrating towards us. So for instance, and so whether you're in front of people face to face or on the telephone, like on the telephone, an empathetic response would be, well, I certainly hear how upset you are about this, right? That would be an empathetic response, as opposed to saying, well, what are you so upset about? This happens all the time in this place, which would be a very dismissive sort of response. So empathy right up front, please. Don't condone the abuse by being passive and or by giving these listening responses. A lot of times if we're being yelled at on the phone or someone's ranting and raving, if we stay, we're not going to hang up on them just yet, but we want to make, if we give these sort of listening attends, it often gives the person license to continue. If we remain absolutely silent, sometimes the person will say eventually, are you still there? It's a closed-ended question, and you get a chance to take back control of the conversation. You say, yes, I am, and I've got a few questions so I can totally understand how I can best help you. And here they come at 160 words a minute. It's one of those things where, you know, we want to like be quiet, because they will come back with it and give you permission, to give you control again. Ask for the person's name, find out who they are. Dale Carnegie had it right. You know, a person's first name is the single most important word in their entire vocabulary. But if I ask for your first name, there are only two possible responses to that question. I'm going to tell you my name is Phil, or I'm going to say, you're not getting my name. Why are you having my name? And if they don't want to give you their name, I think it gives you a good clue that they don't really want to be helped. But if they do give you a name, refer to them by their name because they're giving you permission to call them by their first name. This is where you don't have a big sign at the emergency department or VGH. You've got to tell the person verbally that you are not going to put up with being abused on the phone. And in fact, if they continue being abusive to you, if they continue swearing at you, they are leaving you with no other alternative but to hang up on them. And then you give them the choice, them the power of what you do. The decision is made if it happens. If they really want to be helped, they will give you that decency. If they don't care, you've already told them what you're going to do. As soon as that next abusive word comes out of their mouth, hang up and document. Get out your pen. Unless your phones are recorded, you want to, and even then you should get out your pen really and document that, because you may be asked to talk about why you ended up doing that. We don't want to be randomly doing it with anyone without there being a rationale behind it. So let's we've got a few minutes here. We certainly do. And although there are some other slides that I am going to show you, I want us to sort of run through some scenarios and ask you. So when Sat and Fiona and David and I were putting this together, one of the things that I was wanting to make sure of is that we covered a good number of people in different situations, and Candace as well. Sorry. One of the things, so there'll be some of you that will be in community living organizations. So what are some of what I'd like you to do maybe in the chat area, I'll give you just a little bit of time to think about this. If this applies to you, have you heard anything yet today that you feel would work for you, or have you, and although we've got some more slides to come yet, we're in the latter parts of this for sure. So what are the things that you have heard from me today that makes sense for your particular sort of workplace environment? And maybe just pop those into the chat here if you wouldn't mind, so I can see them pop up. Excellent, thank you. Having an exit strategy. Thank you, Amy. And these are all conversations about things we need to sort of talk about within our work group as well. Providing empathy for residents in our building, massively important, and we can get quickly worn down, I think, with all the pressure that we're facing in our different workplaces and society these days. And I think so and I know the previous webinar was on about psychological health and mental wellness, and that's a combination of that we need to take seriously in order for us to be our best versions and be as safe as possible. Explaining the reasonings why certain policies instead of telling someone what to do, really, really important. I'm glad that resonated. Demonstrating values and dealing with no service clients. Yeah, I think that's really important as well. So really validating the person's emotions. I like the question, is there anything I can do or say to get your compliance? It's a great show. It really is. And I have to say, I was sort of bragging to the team earlier on before we got going live. I did a workshop virtually last night with an organization, and there was a lady in the audience who was married to a police officer, and he made her read the verbal judo book recently, and she said that everything that I had just said, and I've just shared it with you, she learned a lot over the presentation, but also that was a message that was a real powerful message, that's that question. So yeah, I think that's and great. Yeah, so when we're thinking about where we physically are in our workplace, how are we going to get out of there if something goes wrong? And constantly I'm going into organizations and I'm looking at it from a sort of a crime prevention point of view. If you're interested in this stuff, which I hope you are, in your local, either whether your RCMP detachment is close by or municipal police department, there will be professionals trained in there that provide this service free of charge to come in and provide you with an analysis, a crime prevention analysis of your workplace, using this philosophy called crime prevention through environmental design. Yes, you can pay for a consultant to come in, but the police department should be able to provide a community services person that's trained in this philosophy to come and do it for you. And the septed philosophy is a massively important thing that I totally believe in, and that may help the geography of the workplace for sure. Okay, so maybe I can ask, so thank you for your participation there. And maybe what I'll ask is, I'll just put them all up on the board here. So the others that we came up with was obviously harm reduction organizations, immigrant support organizations, and child and youth service providers. Maybe if I've now painted the entire group in this with the audience, maybe I could ask you the same question. Is there something in this presentation so far that resonates with you regarding your particular workplace, which you can not only remind yourself of, but as other people see in the chat area, can think about, maybe it applies to them that they haven't currently thought of. So the yeah, I think that someone says here, thinking about organizational response being scripted and taught to the frontline staff, providing support and consistency. I think so maybe that applies to every organization on this webinar today, where just a consistent approach. And we want, and since we're all about safety, we want to be consistent, because it sends a message not only to other staff if we're thinking about and talking about safety, but also the users of your service. Can you imagine if you're on the plane when we get to do that exciting thing in the future perhaps, and the flight attendant, instead of inviting us to take out the plasticized card in front of us, the flight attendant says, okay, have all of you flown on an airplane before? Put your hands up. So everyone in the plane puts their hands up, and they say, have you gone through the safety demonstration before? And everyone puts their hand up, and yeah, I'm going. And then the flight attendant says, okay, well, in that case, you obviously know what to do. So I'm just going to sit down here and have a cup of coffee. And they don't do the demonstration. You would be freaking out in that plane, because you've basically had a message sent to you that someone doesn't care, or the impression is that someone doesn't care. They think we want them to do the demonstration. We want the person to demonstrate safety to us. So you, as that person who has that you have the legal responsibility for the safety of your team and your staff and the users of your service. The more you can demonstrate that obligation and that you are passionate about it, the better everyone will feel. Yeah, so someone says a reminder that just because something hasn't happened in the past doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. Is hoping that nothing will happen is not a strategy. Oh, I love that. That is a bumper sticker. That is really, yeah. And if you think about, I am fully aware that libraries are a high risk for workplace violence for the staff. We've done work in the States before COVID, obviously. We've been to New Orleans, we've been to Iowa, we've been to Colorado, and all to do with library safety, all to do with this topic here. They have zero barrier to entry. They're nice, warm, friendly places. They have hiding places in the stacks. They have free computer use. There's all sorts of problems. But of course, and the people that work there, just like you work there for a reason. You love educating people. You love being of service, and that can sometimes get in the way. It can shield our eyesight to the risk that's in front of us. Excellent. Thank you so much. This is great. So I'm glad that we are making it's resonating with many of you. Okay. There's another. I know that Fiona's been waiting to activate this one. This is the second poll we're going to do, and we're right on time, Sat, just to give you the heads up. This is a great question. So what is the number one issue that your workplace is currently facing regarding violence in the workplace? This will be very interesting to see the answers to this. We've got 3 minutes to do that, so that's brilliant, and I'm going to carry on. As we near lunchtime, I thought I'd show a picture of an apple. And it's an apple to us, but if you were an Okanagan farmer that sold cider for a living, it's not an apple, it is money. If you were a worm, it's not an apple, it's a house. So depending on your perspective, the same situation is viewed differently and interpreted differently by different people. So you may be working with a person, and you may hear a complaint or a concern, and you may dismiss it and think, well, really? That's no big deal. That would be your inside voice, by the way. that's no big deal. But they are really struggling with it, and it's about their perception, it's about their interpretation of their reality. So we don't want to be dismissive of that. It comes back to that big word again, the most powerful word in the English language, the word empathy. And here's a slide that I'll just run through with these 9 sort of different responses here, because, oops, got that? It's about not, we can't control physically the other person. All we can do is control and manage our response to the other person. So this would be a great one to take a screenshot of and as a list of things to think about. So empathy is massively important. Simplifying messages would be hugely important as well. I don't want to know about the entire International Maritime Organization review of the sinking of the Spirit of Free Enterprise. I just need you to tell me what the sort of story is that came out of that, so it makes sense for me. But don't simplify messages so much, and don't talk to me in a way that I may interpret it as you're talking down to me or making fun of me. So it's about that professional translation you're going to do, which is why we need to think of these things ahead of time. Respect other people's personal space. Don't you be the person that's encroaching on someone's personal space. And space is safety, right? And so when we're further away from someone, we're much better able to observe the entire body language. I mean, here I am standing in front of the camera and it's 3 feet away from me. It's arm's length right now. So you're only seeing head and shoulders. When I'm further away, you get a much bigger picture of what other parts of my body are saying to you, the hands, the legs, whatever it is, the whole picture. Permit some venting. I think venting is a bit of a cathartic experience for some people. I think we've all had one of those, oh, really? And that's a cathartic, helpful moment for people. But you've also got to make sure that you don't allow that venting to supersede personal safety. So you need to enforce that limit on your safety. You can't let someone, be venting in a way that makes it unsafe for you. Avoid overreacting. You are going to tell a lot of people about the story about behind the mask, or whatever the policy is or the rules are of your various organizations that come up consistently. So don't overreact. If you imagine on January the 1st, 2020, when the first BC Ferry employee on the 7 a.m. ferry out of Tawasin to Swartz Bay had to tell the very first person at the bow of the ship, right at the front, why they had to leave their car, they probably did a great job. 250 cars later, at the back of the ship, at the rear stern, do you think the person has the same ability of patience? It can be testing for sure. So avoid overreacting, please. No, do that pulse check and say, maybe you need to have someone else, come in and help you with that. Don't touch people. 3 reasons why you can't, a couple of reasons why you can. 3 reasons why you can't. 1, it is the intentional application of force to the person of another without their consent. So legally, it's an assault. You're breaking the 3-foot rule. So if you can touch me, and when someone is upset, they are not necessarily in a great emotional state for you to put a comforting arm around their shoulder and say, there, don't worry, I'm sure we'll be better next year. A couple of reasons why you can. You are allowed to defend yourself against an unprovoked assault by using as much force as is necessary, as long as that force is not intended to cause death or grievous bodily harm. That's the legislation regarding self-defense out of the criminal code. And you can also touch me if it's a first aid, or actually it's crowd control issues. You're allowed to legally touch me in crowd control to provide safe passage for an emergency situation, and do first aid on me if I am unable to give you permission to touch me. So those are the reasons that you can touch me. But touching staff, just touching people in tense, emotionally charged situations is not something I would espouse for sure. Also, the person may be calling you a bunch of names. They probably will be. They'll be talking about your parentage. It will sound very personal. I'm going to stand here this morning and say, don't take this stuff personally. But it's very much easier to say it than it is to do it. So please mind yourself there. Don't take it personally. Yes. A few more slides and then we are wrapping up here, and then I'll pass it back for Q&A and to Sat. Before we can document something, we've got to write it down. That's the process of documentation. So we remember things prior to documenting things through that concentrating, being in that yellow zone. Association. If someone looks like, or if you remember this presentation because I had the same last name as Clint Eastwood, and my dad featured in The Good, Bad, and the Ugly movie, and had that Ennio Morricone music in the background, that's brilliant. Then that's the association. Whatever it is, use that to remember the person by. Write the other person's name down, and repeating things over and over until you've got a chance to jot it down increases the credibility. When we talk about unpredictable people, three categories that we often talk about would be those short-term momentary crisis moments where a person is upset over something in their lives. They've got some sort of chemical issue, alcohol, drugs, whatever, or they're suffering from a mental illness. How we keep safe is by employing these. And I know you do these all the time. I'm just reminding you of why they work so well. Give me space. Okay, I had a question here. I'm just going to deal with this. If a client backs you into a corner, like physically backs you into a corner, the question is, can you push them away from you, or just keep using your verbal judos until they move and use force? So are you waiting? So legitimately, if you look at the legislation of an assault, so I said to you that you are allowed to defend yourself against an unprovoked assault. So in the legislation, if you feel that you are about to be assaulted because the person is standing right in front of you, they backed you into a corner, you've got no way out, and you feel under threat, that is in the letter of the law an assault. Remember the second definition? If you feel that the person has the immediate means of carrying out what you think is about to happen to you and actually doesn't. So yes, you can legitimately push them away, but I will tell you that often may trigger a negative response from them. But I'm just saying, if that's how you feel that you can get out of there, everything will be based on a review of that later on. But you don't have to, I suppose, to the letter of the law. You shouldn't wait. If you feel under threat, you should be able to defend yourself. The need lots of space here. This is how we are going to deal with a person that is, under in those categories. Give me space. If I'm unpredictable, be patient with me. Gather intelligence about me. Ask me questions about myself. So maybe you can use that as part of the informal, helpful response to me. Don't you become unpredictable to me, please. If you think you're going to do something that may be misinterpreted, tell me what you're going to do before you actually do it. Talk softly and slowly, not too slowly, but there's a philosophy in the world of conflict resolution called mirroring, where if you are calm, where if you keep your voice level, where if you don't get excited, where if you don't get loud, where you don't get energetic in your language, often the person will mirror you. And a lot of this is about listening to people, which is, when we get to the last primary slide here, this is what is in the verbal judo book. This LEAP, this acronym for listening actively. And when we listen actively to someone, which is our biggest, when I went to policing school in London, they said, yep, we're not going to give you, we're going to give you handcuffs, but what we're going to teach you how to do, Phil, is really listen to people really well, talk to people really well, and treat people really well. So that's what we're doing here. We're listening actively. We're empathizing with an upset, ticked off, angry person, maybe. We're asking them questions to get a better understanding of their story, because if you ask me why I'm upset, I will give you a headline of information. And there's a much bigger story underneath that you can pry out of me by asking me building questions. And then the most important part about active listening is for you to paraphrase back to me what it is you have heard in my own words. Because I not only want to be heard by you often, I really want to be understood by you. And that's how you prove that. So to wrap up today, we've got these top 10 things that I wanted to bring your attention to. We are going to trust our gut. We're going to trust our inner canary. Canaries have saved millions of miners' lives around the world. They send off signals of unsafe situations. We all have a canary inside. We all have a sixth sense, a gut that tells us, oops, something feels wrong. Trust that. Be assertively polite, please. All of you are polite. All of you are empathetic. That sometimes you need to be assertively polite, not aggressive, not confrontational, just we need to be consistent. Try the lighter touch first, that on that curve of the verbal judo piece. Changing the ratios of the situation is getting more people there, staff assistants. People are less brave when there's more than one of you, for sure. Stay in that defensive driving mode, being aware of your situation all the time. Always have an exit strategy, and that obviously came through loud and clear with a message, which I'm so glad. Practice the if-then thinking, which is the consequences thinking, right? It's about when we're trying to make sure that we have if you do this, this is going to be the consequence of that, and giving the person the choice. It's like dealing with kids sometimes. If it's not written down, it never happened. That needs to be a bumper sticker as well. Work as a team to provide that sense of team esprit de corps. We've got this safety. It elevates everyone's potential behavior, ability to handle difficult situations. And a reminder about that empathy being that most powerful word in the English language. Okay, if there's a slide here on calling 911, I'm hoping that you know this, but if you don't, need a reminder, these are the things we should be doing. Whether you are serviced by ecom, know that the call comes. We had a conversation with someone the other day that felt that the call, if you called the police, it went straight to the local detachment. It doesn't. It comes to ecom, or if you're different, it could be in Kamloops, where they sent, or on the island in Sydney, no, in Saanich, wherever that sort of central station is, and then it's farmed out from there for sure. But anyway, things you need to just be aware of, I'm sure. Okay, there we are. Maybe I could just ask you, as we're sort of handing this back to Sat here. I'm going to stop sharing the slides here, Sat, so because there's my sort of finishing slide. That's who I am, that's where we are, and now we're just going to do questions. But what I wanted you to do here was maybe in the chat area, just put down what is going to be a takeaway from today. For those of you that are here with us, and I don't even have a count of the number of people here, we can find it somewhere. But what is going to be a takeaway? What did I remind you of? What did I maybe? I hope I didn't teach anything for the first time, but if I did, that's fantastic, and you're in the right place. But what is going to be a takeaway? Maybe just put that into the chat area so other people can see. And now I'm just going to sort of stop sharing the slides, Sat, because it's I think it's time to come back here. Okay.
Oh, all right. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, sir.
Okay, perfect, perfect. Yeah, please, by all means, provide us feedback on Phil's presentation, and questions as well. And it's not going to be limited to that. You're welcome to add those questions to the survey, and also, fire off an email to us as well, and we'll be happy to follow up with you. That being said, I'd like to thank Phil for his engaging and enlightening presentation. I found it very interesting. There were areas that, I never really thought about, and I'm hoping that you also were able to capture some of those thoughts, and we'll take those golden nuggets away as we're moving forward. To wrap things up, again, please, I guess I've been told by IT, once the webinar closes, there will be a survey for you to complete. It's really important that you fill that out because it helps us tremendously on making sure that we provide these kinds of webinars to you and really fine tune this as we're moving forward. In just a couple of quick notes, in late October, the council will be hosting a WorkSafe BC rate consult for 2022. And in December, our objective is to have a presentation on the violence risk assessment tool with Health and Safety 101 presentation as well. And that particular presentation will be sector specific for you as well. And we're very excited about that. Now, on behalf of the council, we'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the hard work organizations and their dedicated staff bring each and every day to support the most vulnerable people throughout the communities in British Columbia. And with that, I want to give special thanks to Eric, Sherry, Candace, David, and Fiona for all their hard work in the background for making this possible today. And so that being said, this concludes 10 minutes extra, 10 minutes for you to conclude the webinar. And actually, Phil, are you related though to Clint Eastwood?
Amazingly, no. I wish I was. And I told you before, I don't like guns and I can't shoot, so I'm definitely not related to him.
Yes, you noted that. Thank you again. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful week and take care of yourselves. And again, keep up the wonderful work. All the very best to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much indeed. I appreciate that.